The Denali incident, when the mountain claimed its own doctor. Sarah Catherine Winters pressed her weathered hiking boot against the rocky outcrop and gazed across the vast expanse of Denali National Park, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp September air. At 42, she had spent the better part of 2 decades studying the behavioral patterns of North American brown bears. But standing here at 4,200 feet above sea level on the Thoroughfare Ridge Trail, she felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that came with entering prime grizzly territory. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tundra, illuminating patches of crimson fireweed and golden dwarf birch that painted the landscape in autumn's final palette. Behind her, the sounds of her research team setting up their temporary monitoring station echoed against the granite walls of the surrounding peaks. Sarah had assembled what she considered to be the most qualified team she had ever worked with for this particular expedition. Dr. Marcus James Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had spent 12 years tracking the movement patterns of individual bears throughout the Denali ecosystem. At 38, Marcus possessed an intuitive understanding of bear behavior that bordered on supernatural, earned through countless hours of silent observation and meticulous data collection. His dark eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading the subtle signs in the landscape that others missed entirely. Marcus had grown up in Anchorage, the son of a Mexican-American father who worked for the Alaska Railroad, and a mother whose Athabascan heritage connected her deeply to the land they now studied. This unique cultural background had given him perspectives on wildlife that purely academic researchers often lacked. Standing beside Marcus was Jennifer Lynn O'Connor, a 29-year-old graduate student from Montana State University whose doctoral dissertation focused on the impact of climate change on bear denning behaviors. Jennifer had earned her stripes through 3 summers of fieldwork in Glacier National Park, where she had documented the shifting patterns of grizzly hibernation sites as warming temperatures altered traditional denning locations. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held the intensity of someone who had dedicated her life to understanding one of North America's most formidable predators. Jennifer had grown up on a ranch outside of Bozeman, where encounters with black bears raiding chicken coops had first sparked her fascination with ursine behavior. Her father, a 3rd-generation rancher named Patrick O'Connor, had taught her to read animal tracks before she could properly read books, skills that had proven invaluable in her scientific career. The 4th member of their core research team was Dr. Robert Allen Thornfield, a bear attack specialist who consulted with park services throughout Alaska and Western Canada. At 56, Robert had investigated more bear-human encounters than perhaps any other individual in North America. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had spent decades dealing with the aftermath of wildlife incidents, and his grey beard was flecked with premature white from the stress of his chosen profession. Robert had joined their expedition specifically because recent GPS collar data indicated that several large male grizzlies were congregating in this particular region of Denali, behavior that was both unusual and potentially concerning. His presence served as both scientific expertise and practical insurance, as Robert carried specialized equipment designed to deter aggressive bear encounters. Supporting the scientific team were 3 graduate research assistants who had volunteered for what they understood would be challenging field conditions. Thomas Michael Chen, a 26-year-old from UC Berkeley, was pursuing his master's degree in wildlife ecology with a focus on large carnivore population dynamics. Thomas had emigrated from Taiwan with his family when he was 12 years old, and his methodical approach to data collection reflected both his engineering background and his deep respect for the precision required in wildlife research. His parents, Both engineers who had sacrificed considerably to provide their son with educational opportunities in America had initially been horrified by his decision to pursue a career that involved deliberate proximity to dangerous wildlife, but they had eventually come to understand his passion for conservation. The second graduate assistant was Amanda Rose Patterson, a 24-year-old from the University of Wyoming whose undergraduate work had focused on the nutritional ecology of omnivorous mammals. Amanda had grown up in Jackson Hole, where her father worked as a wilderness guide, and her mother taught environmental science at the local high school. Her familiarity with backcountry survival skills and her calm demeanor under pressure had made her an ideal candidate for this expedition. Amanda possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of edible and medicinal plants, skills inherited from her grandmother, who had homesteaded in Wyoming during the 1940s and learned to live off the land during difficult economic times. The final research assistant was David Paul Kowalski, a 28-year-old former military medic who was transitioning into wildlife biology after completing his service with the 10th Mountain Division. David had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where his medical training had been put to use in conditions far more challenging than anything they expected to encounter in Denali. His decision to pursue graduate studies in wildlife biology represented a conscious effort to channel his skills toward conservation rather than conflict. David's muscular frame and alert posture reflected his military background, but his gentle manner with both animals and people revealed the compassionate nature that had drawn him to medical training in the first place. The expedition also included 2 essential support personnel who would prove crucial in the events that were about to unfold. James William Moose Morrison was a 53-year-old bush pilot and wilderness guide who had been flying in Alaska for over 30 years. Moose had earned his nickname not only because of his imposing 6'4" frame, but also because of his uncanny ability to spot moose from incredible distances while flying his modified Cessna 185. His weather-beaten face and perpetually oil-stained hands told the story of decades spent maintaining aircraft in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth. Moose had grown up in Fairbanks, the son of a pipeline worker who had come north during the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the 1970s. His intimate knowledge of Denali's backcountry and his ability to land his aircraft in impossibly small clearings had made him the preferred pilot for research expeditions throughout central Alaska. The final member of their group was Elena Marie Vasquez, a 35-year-old wilderness photographer and videographer who was documenting their research for a National Geographic feature on climate change and wildlife adaptation. Elena had spent the previous 5 years traveling to remote locations around the world, capturing images that helped bring conservation issues to public attention. Her work had taken her from the Arctic tundra to the Amazon rainforest, but she considered Alaska to be her spiritual home. Elena had been born in Mexico City, but raised in Los Angeles after her family immigrated when she was 7 years old. Her artistic eye and her technical expertise with camera equipment had made her one of the most sought-after wildlife photographers in North America, but she was equally valued for her ability to remain calm and focused during unpredictable situations. The team had arrived at their research site 3 days earlier, on September 7, 2025, after a complex logistical operation that had required 2 separate flights in Moose's Cessna to transport all their equipment and supplies. Their base camp was situated on a relatively flat section of tundra, approximately 2 miles north of the Thoroughfare Ridge Trail, in an area that GPS coordinates placed at 63.7328 degrees north latitude and 150.8947 degrees west longitude. The location had been carefully selected based on recent satellite collar data that indicated high levels of bear activity in the surrounding valleys. particularly around several known salmon-spawning streams that fed into the Toklat River system. Sarah's decision to establish their research site in this particular location had been influenced by several factors that painted a complex picture of changing bear behaviors throughout the Denali ecosystem. Climate data from the past decade indicated that warming temperatures were causing earlier snowmelt and later freeze-up periods, effectively extending the active season for brown bears by several weeks. This extended activity period was forcing bears to seek additional food sources later into the autumn months, bringing them into contact with human activity areas more frequently than historical patterns would suggest. Additionally, drought conditions in parts of western Alaska had reduced the availability of traditional food sources like blueberries and soapberries, causing some bear populations to expand their foraging ranges into areas they had not traditionally utilized. The morning of September 10th dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and a light wind from the northwest that carried the scent of early snow from the higher elevations. Sarah stood outside her tent at 5:47 a.m., sipping coffee from a stainless steel mug while reviewing the day's research protocol. Their plan called for establishing a series of remote camera traps along known bear trails that descended from the ridgeline toward the river valleys, work that would require the team to split into smaller groups and cover a considerable amount of terrain. The previous day's reconnaissance had identified several promising locations where fresh bear sign indicated regular travel corridors, and Sarah was eager to begin collecting data that might help explain the unusual congregation of large males that had been detected in the area. Marcus emerged from his tent at 5:52 a.m., already dressed in his field clothes and carrying the GPS unit that would guide their navigation throughout the day. His movements were economical and purposeful, reflecting years of experience working in conditions where efficiency could mean the difference between success and failure. Marcus had spent the previous evening studying topographical maps and satellite imagery, identifying potential routes that would allow them to cover the maximum amount of territory while minimizing their exposure to dangerous terrain. His plan called for the team to work in 3 separate groups, with each group responsible for establishing camera traps along a different drainage system. Jennifer appeared from her tent at 5:58 a.m., her field notebook already in hand, as she began recording weather observations and other environmental data that might influence bear behavior throughout the day. Her meticulous attention to detail had made her an invaluable member of the research team, as she consistently noticed patterns and correlations that others might miss. Jennifer's background on her family's ranch had taught her to pay attention to subtle changes in animal behavior that often preceded significant events, skills that had proven remarkably applicable to her scientific work. Dr. Thornfield was the next to emerge at 6:03 a.m., carrying the specialized equipment case that contained his bear deterrent devices and emergency communication equipment. His methodical inspection of each piece of equipment reflected the gravity with which he approached their work, understanding that preparation and attention to detail were their primary defenses against the inherent dangers of working in prime grizzly habitat. Robert's case contained several types of bear spray, noise-making devices, and a satellite communication unit that could summon emergency assistance even from their remote location. The 3 graduate assistants emerged from their shared tent at 6:08 a.m., moving with the eager energy of young researchers who were excited to be participating in what they understood to be groundbreaking work. Thomas immediately began checking the battery levels on their camera trap equipment, while Amanda started organizing the day's food supplies and David conducted a systematic inventory of their first aid equipment. Their coordinated efficiency reflected hours of practice and planning, as well as their understanding that small mistakes in the backcountry could rapidly escalate into serious problems. Moose Morrison had been awake since 5:30 a.m., conducting his daily inspection of the aircraft that would serve as their emergency evacuation route if circumstances required it. His thorough examination of engine components, control surfaces, and navigation equipment reflected the airline-level standards he maintained even when operating in remote wilderness areas. Moose's aircraft was equipped with specialized tundra tires that allowed landing on rough terrain, as well as emergency medical supplies and survival equipment that exceeded standard requirements for bush-flying operations. Elena Vasquez emerged at 6:12 a.m., with her camera equipment already assembled and tested, ready to document the day's research activities for her National Geographic assignment. Her ability to capture compelling images while remaining unobtrusive to the scientific work had made her a valued member of the team, and her presence added an important dimension to their research by helping to communicate their findings to broader public audiences. Elena's equipment included both still cameras and video recording devices, as well as specialized lenses designed for wildlife photography in challenging lighting conditions. By 6:30 a.m., the entire team had assembled around their camp kitchen area for breakfast and a final review of the day's plans. Sarah spread the topographical maps across a folding table, while Marcus used a red marker to indicate the planned routes for each of the three research groups. The first group, consisting of Sarah, Jennifer, and Thomas, would work their way north along the ridgeline toward a series of avalanche chutes where bear sign had been particularly heavy. The second group, composed of Marcus, Amanda, and David, would descend into the valley to the east and establish camera positions near several known berry patches that were still producing fruit despite the advancing season. The third group would be Dr. Thornfield and Elena, who would work together to document known bear trails and feeding areas while maintaining the flexibility to respond to any unexpected situations that might arise. Each group carried identical emergency equipment, including GPS units, satellite communicators, first aid supplies, and bear spray. They had established radio check-in protocols that required contact every 2 hours, with predetermined emergency signals that could summon immediate assistance if needed. Their base camp location had been shared with park rangers, and Moose maintained constant radio communication with flight service stations that could coordinate rescue operations if circumstances required them. The weather forecast for September 10th called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures ranging from 28 degrees Fahrenheit in the early morning to a high of 45 degrees by mid-afternoon. Wind speeds were expected to remain light and variable, with visibility forecast to be excellent throughout the day. These conditions were ideal for their research work, as bears would likely be active during the warmer afternoon hours while remaining visible in the open tundra environment. At 7:15 a.m., after completing their final equipment checks and reviewing emergency procedures one last time, the three research groups departed base camp in different directions. Sarah's group headed north along a game trail that followed the crest of the ridge, while Marcus's group descended eastward into the valley through a series of switchbacks that minimized their exposure to loose rock and steep terrain. Dr. Thornfield and Elena departed toward the southwest, following GPS coordinates that would take them to areas where previous research had documented high levels of bear activity. The morning air was crisp and clear, with visibility extending for miles across the tundra landscape. Sarah's group made steady progress along the ridgeline, stopping frequently to examine bear sign and identify optimal locations for camera placement. The terrain consisted primarily of low-growing Arctic vegetation interspersed with scattered boulders and rocky outcrops that provided natural vantage points for observation. Thomas documented each potential camera location with GPS coordinates and detailed notes about sight lines and potential approaches that bears might use. Jennifer's field notebook filled rapidly with observations about plant phenology and wildlife sign, data that would help correlate bear behavior with food availability and environmental conditions. Her trained eye spotted evidence of bear activity that others might have missed, including claw marks on trees, overturned stones where bears had searched for insects, and scattered scat that provided information about recent feeding patterns. Each observation was carefully recorded with precise location data and detailed descriptions that would support their subsequent analysis. Marcus's group encountered their first significant bear sign at 8:23 a.m., when they discovered a series of massive paw prints in soft soil near a small stream that meandered through the valley floor. The tracks measured approximately 11 inches in length and 8 inches in width, indicating an adult male bear of considerable size. The depth of the impressions in the soil suggested an animal weighing well over 600 pounds, potentially approaching the 800-pound range that represented the upper size limit for interior Alaskan grizzlies. Marcus used a ruler to measure the tracks precisely, while Amanda photographed them for documentation purposes, and David recorded GPS coordinates that would allow them to relocate the site for future reference. The spacing between the paw prints indicated that the bear had been moving at a deliberate walking pace rather than running or foraging, suggesting purposeful travel toward a specific destination. Marcus noted that the tracks appeared to be no more than 6 to 8 hours old, based on the sharpness of the edges and the absence of wind-blown debris in the impressions. This timing placed the bear's passage through the area sometime during the previous evening or early morning hours, when temperatures would have been near freezing and bear activity would typically be minimal. Amanda's examination of the surrounding vegetation revealed additional evidence of the bear's presence, including broken branches on low-growing shrubs and several overturned rocks where the animal had apparently been searching for grubs or other protein sources. The pattern of disturbance suggested systematic foraging behavior rather than random destruction, indicating a bear that was actively seeking food rather than simply traveling through the area. This behavior was consistent with the pre-denning feeding patterns that bears typically exhibit during the autumn months, when they attempt to build fat reserves for their upcoming winter hibernation period. David's medical training had taught him to pay attention to details that might indicate potential threats, and his examination of the bear sign revealed several concerning elements. The size of the tracks suggested an animal at the upper end of the size range for Alaskan interior grizzlies, while the systematic nature of the foraging behavior indicated a bear that was comfortable operating in this particular area. Most concerning was the direction of travel indicated by the tracks, which appeared to lead toward the general area where their base camp was located, although the distance and intervening terrain made any immediate threat unlikely. At 9:45 a.m., Dr. Thornfield and Eleanor encountered what would later be identified as the first definitive sign of the animal that would come to dominate their expedition. While photographing a known bear trail that wound through a dense patch of dwarf birch, Elena noticed a series of claw marks on a large spruce tree that stood isolated in the middle of an open meadow. The marks were fresh, with sticky sap still oozing from the cuts in the bark, and they extended from approximately 3 feet above ground level to a height of nearly 8 feet. The height and spacing of the marks indicated an animal of exceptional size, potentially larger than any bear that had been previously documented in this particular region of Denali. Robert's immediate response was to examine the area around the marked tree for additional sign, a search that revealed the most extensive evidence of bear activity that any member of the team had yet encountered. The ground around the base of the tree was heavily disturbed, with multiple sets of paw prints indicating that the animal had spent considerable time in this immediate area. Several smaller trees showed evidence of having been pushed over or broken, suggesting either aggressive behavior or simply the casual destruction that could result from a very large bear moving through dense vegetation. Elena's photographic documentation of the scene would later prove crucial to the subsequent investigation, as her images captured details that would help wildlife experts reconstruct the bear's behavior and estimate its size with greater accuracy than visual observations alone. Her specialized lenses allowed her to photograph the claw marks with sufficient detail to measure both the length and spacing of individual claws, data that could be used to estimate the overall size of the bear's paws and, by extension, the animal's total body mass. The discovery of this extensive bear sign prompted Dr. Thornfield to make the first unscheduled radio contact with the other research groups, transmitting a detailed description of their findings and recommending increased vigilance throughout the remainder of the day. His message, transmitted at 10:02 a.m., included precise GPS coordinates of the marked tree and a recommendation that all team members consider the possibility that they were operating in the territory of an exceptionally large and potentially territorial male bear. Sarah's response to Robert's radio transmission reflected her years of experience working with potentially dangerous wildlife, as she immediately implemented enhanced safety protocols for her group while continuing their planned research activities. These protocols included increased frequency of radio contacts, mandatory travel in single file with constant visual contact between team members, and a requirement that all bear spray be readily accessible rather than stored in backpacks. Jennifer and Thomas responded to these enhanced precautions with professional calm, understanding that their success and safety depended on maintaining proper respect for the inherent dangers of their work environment. Marcus's group received Dr. Thornfield's radio transmission while they were in the process of installing their second camera trap of the day, and his response reflected both his experience with bear behavior and his understanding of the specific challenges posed by large male grizzlies during the pre-denning period. Marcus made the decision to alter his group's planned route slightly, choosing to work in areas with better visibility and easier escape routes rather than continuing into the dense vegetation where they had originally intended to place additional cameras. The morning progressed without further dramatic discoveries, but each research group continued to encounter evidence of extensive bear activity throughout their respective work areas. Sarah's group documented 14 separate sets of bear tracks along their ridgeline route, including several that appeared to have been made by the same large individual that Dr. Thornfield and Elena had encountered near the marked tree. The consistency of track size and gait pattern suggested that a single bear was traveling extensively throughout the area, behavior that was unusual for this time of year when bears typically concentrated their activities around specific food sources. Jennifer's botanical observations revealed that food availability in the area was actually below normal for this time of year, with berry production significantly reduced compared to historical averages and many traditional food plants already showing signs of frost damage that would typically not occur until later in the autumn. This reduced food availability could explain the extensive travel patterns they were observing, as bears might be ranging more widely than usual in search of adequate nutrition to support their pre-denning feeding requirements. By 11:30 a.m., all three research groups had successfully installed their assigned camera traps and were beginning to work their way back toward base camp for the scheduled lunch break and data review session. The morning's discoveries had provided them with more extensive evidence of bear activity than they had anticipated, suggesting that their research site was ideally positioned to document the behavioral adaptations they were studying. However, the size and apparent territorial behavior of the bears they were tracking had also introduced an element of concern that had not been present during their initial planning phases. Thomas Chen's technical expertise with the camera trap equipment had proven invaluable throughout the morning, as his systematic approach to installation and testing ensured that each device would function properly in the challenging environmental conditions they expected to encounter. His background in engineering had taught him to anticipate potential failure modes and build redundancy into their systems, skills that would prove crucial in the events that were about to unfold. Thomas had also taken the initiative to include additional battery packs and memory cards with each camera installation, ensuring that their data collection would continue even if scheduled maintenance visits were delayed by weather or other circumstances. Amanda Patterson's field skills had complemented Thomas's technical expertise perfectly, as her ability to read terrain and animal behavior helped them identify the optimal placement for each camera trap. Her understanding of how bears moved through the landscape allowed them to position their equipment to maximize the probability of capturing useful footage, while minimizing the risk of equipment damage from curious or aggressive animals. Amanda's contributions to their morning's work had been particularly valuable in areas where bear trails were not immediately obvious, as her trained eye could identify subtle signs of regular animal travel that others might miss. David Kowalski's military background had provided an additional dimension of security awareness that had proved valuable throughout the morning's activities. His habit of regularly scanning the surrounding terrain for potential threats had identified several approach routes that bears might use to reach their work areas, information that allowed the team to position themselves with better visibility and easier escape options. David's medical training had also influenced his evaluation of their work sites, as he consistently considered how emergency medical care might be provided if accidents occurred in remote locations with challenging terrain. At 12:15 p.m., Sarah's group was the first to arrive back at base camp, where they immediately began organizing their field notes and camera trap data for the afternoon planning session. Sarah's preliminary analysis of the morning's discoveries suggested that they were documenting an unusually complex pattern of bear behavior that might represent a response to changing environmental conditions throughout the broader Denali ecosystem. The extent of travel indicated by the tracks they had documented suggested that individual bears were ranging across much larger territories than previous research had indicated, potentially in response to reduced food availability or increased competition for traditional resources. Marcus's group arrived at base camp at 12:28 p.m., and his immediate assessment was that they had encountered evidence of at least 3 separate adult bears during their morning's work, including the large individual that appeared to be traveling extensively throughout the area. Marcus's experience reading track sign had allowed him to identify subtle differences in paw size and gait pattern that indicated multiple animals, information that would be crucial for understanding the population dynamics of bears using this particular area. His data suggested that bear density in their study area might be higher than park managers had previously estimated, a finding that could have significant implications for visitor safety and management policies. Dr. Thornfield and Elena were the last to return to base camp, arriving at 12:44 p.m. with extensive photographic documentation of the bear sign they had encountered throughout the morning. Robert's immediate recommendation was that they modify their afternoon plans to focus on areas with better visibility and easier access to emergency evacuation routes, rather than continuing to work in the dense vegetation where much of the bear activity appeared to be concentrated. His experience investigating bear attacks had taught him to recognize situations where the risk level might be increasing beyond acceptable limits, and several factors from their morning's work had raised his concern level significantly. Elena's photographic documentation from the morning provided visual evidence that supported Dr. Thornfield's concerns about the size and potential aggressiveness of the bears they were studying. Her images of claw marks and other bear sign could be analyzed to provide more precise estimates of bear size than field measurements alone. and her preliminary assessment suggested that they were dealing with animals at the very upper end of the size range for interior Alaskan grizzlies. Elena's artistic eye had also captured images that conveyed the raw power and presence of the bears that had created the sign they were documenting, photographs that would later help investigators understand the magnitude of the animals they were studying. The team's lunch break provided an opportunity for detailed discussion of their morning's discoveries and collaborative analysis of the patterns they were beginning to identify. Sarah facilitated a systematic review of each group's findings, with particular attention to correlating GPS coordinates and timing to develop a comprehensive picture of bear movement patterns throughout their study area. The emerging pattern suggested that bears were using their research area as a major travel corridor, with multiple individuals passing through the region on a regular basis as they move between different feeding areas and denning sites. Jennifer's compilation of botanical data revealed that food scarcity was likely driving the extensive travel patterns they were documenting, as traditional autumn food sources were significantly below normal availability throughout the region. Her data showed that berry production was down by approximately 60% compared to historical averages, while nut production from dwarf birch and other traditional food sources was virtually non-existent. These conditions would force bears to travel much more extensively than usual while searching for adequate nutrition to support their pre-denning feeding requirements. Thomas's technical analysis of their camera trap placements indicated that they had achieved excellent coverage of the primary travel routes through their study area, with overlapping fields of view that would allow them to track individual bears as they moved through the landscape. His systematic approach to equipment installation had also included backup power systems and weather protection that would allow their cameras to continue functioning even in severe conditions, ensuring that they would capture data regardless of weather changes that might occur during their study period. Marcus's interpretation of the track data they had collected suggested that they were dealing with at least 4 separate adult bears, including 2 large males, 1 medium-sized individual that could be either male or female, and 1 animal whose tracks were too indistinct to allow confident size estimation. The presence of multiple large males in the same general area was unusual for this time of year, when bears typically avoided each other except during mating season or around concentrated food sources. This aggregation of large males suggested either exceptional food availability that they had not yet identified, or territorial disputes that might be increasing stress levels and unpredictable behavior among the bears they were studying. Dr. Thornfield's assessment of their morning's work emphasized the need for increased caution during their afternoon activities, as several factors had combined to create what he considered to be elevated risk conditions. The presence of multiple large bears in a relatively small area, combined with evidence of food scarcity and unusual movement patterns, created the potential for encounters that could escalate rapidly into dangerous situations. Robert's recommendation was that they modify their afternoon plans to work exclusively in areas with excellent visibility and multiple escape routes, postponing any work in dense vegetation until they had a better understanding of bear behavior patterns in the area. Amanda's practical experience with large mammals had provided insights that complemented the more academic perspectives of her colleagues, as her ranch background had taught her to recognize behavioral indicators that might suggest increasing stress or agitation in large animals. Her observations from the morning's work included several subtle signs that suggested the bears they were studying might be experiencing higher than normal stress levels, including more extensive trail marking and what appeared to be more aggressive vegetation damage than would typically be associated with normal foraging behavior. David's military background had conditioned him to constantly assess tactical situations and identify potential threats before they materialized into actual dangers. His evaluation of their morning's work identified several factors that, while not immediately threatening, represented potential risk escalation if circumstances changed. These factors included their distance from immediate evacuation options, the limited visibility in some of their planned work areas, and the apparent concentration of large bears in areas where escape routes might be restricted by terrain features. Elena's perspective as a professional wildlife photographer provided additional insights into bear behavior based on her extensive experience observing large mammals in their natural environments. Her assessment was that the bears they were studying were exhibiting behavior patterns consistent with animals under stress, possibly due to competition for limited food resources or territorial disputes. Elena's experience had taught her to recognize subtle behavioral indicators that often preceded more dramatic displays of aggression, and several elements of their morning's discoveries had triggered her professional instincts about potentially escalating situations. Moose Morrison's assessment of weather conditions and flight safety considerations indicated that afternoon flying conditions would remain excellent, ensuring that emergency evacuation remained a viable option throughout their planned work period. His aircraft was fueled and ready for immediate departure if circumstances required it, and he had identified several potential landing sites near their planned afternoon work areas that could be used for emergency evacuation if needed. Moose's 30 years of flying experience in Alaska had taught him to always maintain multiple backup plans when operating in remote areas, and his preparation reflected the serious approach he took to his role in their expedition's safety planning. At 1:30 p.m., after completing their lunch and data review session, the team prepared to depart for their afternoon research activities with modified plans that reflected the elevated caution level recommended by Dr. Thornfield. The afternoon work would focus on areas with excellent visibility and multiple escape routes, postponing any activities in dense vegetation until they had a better understanding of bear behavior patterns in their study area. Each group would maintain more frequent radio contact than originally planned, with check-ins scheduled every hour rather than every 2 hours. Sarah's group would spend the afternoon reviewing and adjusting the camera traps they had installed during the morning, fine-tuning positioning and settings based on their improved understanding of bear travel patterns in the area. This work would also allow them to remain in areas they had already identified as relatively safe, while still contributing valuable data to their research objectives. Jennifer had identified several additional botanical sampling sites that would provide important data about food availability without requiring travel into areas where bear activity appeared to be most concentrated. Marcus's group planned to conduct detailed mapping of bear trails and feeding areas in the valley, work that would complement their morning's camera trap installations while keeping them in areas with excellent visibility and easy access to evacuation routes. Amanda had identified several promising sites for soil sampling that would provide data about nutrient availability and plant productivity, information that would help explain the food scarcity that appeared to be driving unusual bear behavior patterns. David would assist with both mapping and sampling activities while maintaining his role as the group's medical officer and security observer. Dr. Thornfield and Eleanor would spend the afternoon conducting detailed documentation of the extensive bear sign they had discovered during the morning, work that would provide crucial evidence for understanding the size and behavior patterns of the bears they were studying. Elena's photographic documentation would be particularly important for subsequent analysis by wildlife experts who could provide additional insights into bear behavior and population dynamics. Robert planned to establish several observation posts that would allow them to monitor bear activity in real time, while maintaining safe distances and easy access to escape routes. At 1:45 p.m., The three research groups departed base camp for their afternoon activities, following the modified safety protocols that reflected their improved understanding of the risk environment in their study area. Radio check-ins were scheduled for 2:45 p.m., 3:45 p.m. and 4:45 p.m., with an additional requirement for immediate contact if any group encountered fresh bear sign or observed actual bears in their work areas. Each group carried identical emergency equipment, including multiple GPS units, satellite communicators, first aid supplies, and bear spray, with clear protocols for summoning immediate assistance if circumstances required it. The afternoon weather conditions remained excellent, with partly cloudy skies, light winds, and temperatures reaching the forecast high of 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility across the tundra landscape extended for several miles in all directions, providing ideal conditions for spotting bears at safe distances and maintaining situational awareness of potential threats. The combination of excellent weather and modified safety protocols gave the team confidence that they could continue their research activities while managing the elevated risk level that their morning's discoveries had revealed. Sarah's group made steady progress during their afternoon work, successfully adjusting camera trap settings and positions based on their improved understanding of bear travel patterns. Jennifer's botanical sampling provided additional evidence of the food scarcity that appeared to be driving unusual bear behavior, with several traditional food sources showing signs of stress or early senescence that would significantly reduce their nutritional value for bears preparing for hibernation. Thomas's technical modifications to their camera equipment included enhanced motion sensitivity settings that would improve their ability to capture footage of bears traveling at different speeds and distances. At 2:45 p.m., all three research groups completed their first scheduled radio check-in without reporting any concerning developments. Sarah's group had successfully completed their camera trap modifications and was beginning botanical sampling in areas with excellent visibility. Marcus's group had identified and mapped several previously unknown bear trails, providing valuable data about movement patterns while working in areas with multiple escape routes. Dr. Thornfield and Elena had completed extensive photographic documentation of bear sign and had established 2 observation posts that provided excellent visibility across key travel corridors. Marcus's group encountered their most significant discovery of the afternoon at 3:17 p.m., when they located what appeared to be a day bed used by one of the large bears they had been tracking. The bed was situated in a patch of dense willow shrubs that provided excellent concealment while offering commanding views of the surrounding valley. The size of the depression in the vegetation suggested a bear weighing well over 700 pounds, while the strategic location indicated an animal that was deliberately selecting positions that provided both security and tactical advantage. Amanda's examination of the vegetation around the daybed revealed that the bear had spent considerable time in this location, possibly several hours during the previous day or night. The pattern of disturbed vegetation suggested systematic surveillance behavior rather than simple resting, indicating a bear that was actively monitoring the surrounding area for threats or opportunities. This type of behavior was consistent with a territorial male bear during the autumn period, when competition for food resources and preparation for denning could create heightened awareness and potentially aggressive responses to perceived threats. David's assessment of the day bed location from a tactical perspective identified several concerning factors, including limited visibility of approach routes and restricted escape options due to the surrounding terrain. His military training had taught him to evaluate positions from both defensive and offensive perspectives, and his analysis suggested that a bear using this location would have significant advantages in any encounter with humans who might inadvertently approach the area. The combination of concealment, elevated position and restricted approach routes created what David recognized as a classic ambush position, whether intentionally selected for that purpose or simply representing optimal habitat from the bear's perspective. Marcus made the decision to immediately report this discovery to the other research groups, transmitting detailed GPS coordinates and a description of the tactical situation at 3:23 p.m. His radio transmission included a recommendation that all groups avoid the immediate area around the daybed and increase their vigilance for bears that might be monitoring their activities from concealed positions. The discovery reinforced Dr. Thornfield's earlier assessment that they were dealing with bears exhibiting elevated stress levels and potentially territorial behavior that could create dangerous situations. Sarah's response to Marcus's radio transmission was to implement immediate modifications to her group's afternoon plans, moving their activities to areas with even better visibility and easier access to escape routes. Her experience with bear behavior had taught her that the discovery of a strategic daybed location indicated they were dealing with a bear that was actively managing its territory and monitoring for potential threats. This type of behavior suggested an animal that might respond aggressively to human presence if it perceived encroachment on its territory or resources. Dr. Thornfield's assessment of Marcus's discovery confirmed his growing concern about the risk level in their study area, as the strategic positioning of the daybed indicated behavioral patterns consistent with a dominant male bear under stress. Robert's experience investigating bear attacks had taught him to recognize situations where multiple risk factors were beginning to align, creating the potential for encounters that could escalate rapidly into dangerous situations. The combination of food scarcity, territorial behavior, and strategic positioning suggested that they were dealing with bears that might be more likely to respond aggressively to human presence than would normally be expected. Elena's photographic work throughout the afternoon had documented extensive additional evidence of bear activity, including several more claw-marked trees and numerous feeding sites where bears had been digging for roots and grubs. Her images revealed patterns of vegetation damage that suggested bears were spending much more time and effort searching for food than would typically be necessary during the autumn feeding period. This intensive foraging behavior was consistent with the food scarcity that Jennifer's botanical data had documented, and it suggested that bears in the area might be experiencing nutritional stress that could affect their behavior patterns. At 3:45 p.m., all three research groups completed their second scheduled radio check-in, with Marcus's group reporting their discovery of the daybed and Dr. Thornfield recommending enhanced vigilance for all team members. The cumulative evidence from their afternoon work continued to support the assessment that bear density and activity levels in their study area were higher than had been anticipated, while food scarcity was creating conditions that might lead to increased stress and unpredictable behavior among the bears they were studying. Thomas Chen's afternoon work with camera trap adjustments had revealed that their equipment was already capturing extensive bear activity, with several cameras showing evidence of being investigated by curious bears during the brief period since their installation. His review of initial footage revealed clear images of at least 2 different bears, including one individual that appeared to match the size estimates they had developed based on track measurements and other physical evidence. The footage provided the first visual confirmation of the exceptional size of some of the bears they were studying, with one individual appearing significantly larger than typical interior Alaskan grizzlies. Amanda's botanical sampling had revealed additional evidence of environmental stress affecting traditional bear food sources, with several plant species showing signs of drought stress and early senescence that would significantly reduce their nutritional value during the critical pre-denning feeding period. Her data suggested that bears in the area might need to expand their foraging ranges significantly or accept lower quality nutrition during their preparation for hibernation, both factors that could contribute to increased stress levels and altered behavior patterns. David's medical assessment of the afternoon's activities identified several factors that were increasing their exposure to potential bear encounters, including the time they were spending in each location and the predictable patterns of their research activities. His recommendation was that they consider modifying their approach to reduce the time spent in any single location and introduce more randomness into their movement patterns, making it more difficult for bears to predict their activities and potentially intercept them. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, environmental conditions began to change in ways that would significantly affect the events about to unfold. Cloud cover increased from the northwest, reducing the excellent visibility they had enjoyed throughout the day, and creating conditions where bears could approach much closer before being detected. Temperature began dropping more rapidly than forecast, reaching 38 degrees Fahrenheit by 4:15 p.m. and continuing to fall as the sun moved lower in the western sky. At 4:45 p.m., Dr. Thornfield and Elena completed their final scheduled radio check-in of the day, reporting that they had finished their photographic documentation work and were beginning to work their way back toward base camp for the evening data review session. Robert's assessment was that they had gathered extensive evidence of bear activity throughout the day, but that changing weather conditions and approaching darkness recommended ending field activities earlier than originally planned. His recommendation was that all groups should plan to return to base camp by 5:30 p.m. to allow adequate time for travel before visibility became seriously compromised. Sarah's group acknowledged Dr. Thornfield's recommendation and began securing their afternoon's work at 4:48 p.m. with plans to return to base camp via the same route they had used during the morning. Jennifer's afternoon botanical sampling had been completed successfully, providing valuable data about plant productivity and nutritional availability that would help explain the bear behavior patterns they were documenting. Thomas had finished his camera trap adjustments and was confident that their equipment would continue collecting useful data throughout the evening and overnight hours. Marcus's group began their return journey at 4:52 p.m., following a route that would take them past several of the camera trap locations they had installed during the morning. Amanda had completed her soil sampling work and was carrying samples that would provide important data about nutrient availability and soil productivity in areas where bears had been foraging extensively. David maintained his role as security observer during their return journey, continuously scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of bear activity or other potential threats. The temperature continued dropping as evening approached, reaching 34 degrees Fahrenheit by 5 p.m., and creating conditions where human scent would carry much farther than it had during the warmer afternoon hours. Wind patterns were also shifting, with the light northwest breeze that had prevailed throughout the day being replaced by more variable wind directions that could carry human scent in unpredictable patterns. These changing conditions meant that bears could potentially detect human presence from much greater distances than had been possible during the afternoon hours. At 5:15 p.m., Marcus's group encountered the first indication that their situation was about to change dramatically. While passing near one of the camera trap locations they had installed during the morning, David noticed that fresh bear tracks had been superimposed over their own footprints from earlier in the day. The tracks were massive, clearly matching the size estimates they had developed for the largest individual they had been studying, and they indicated that the bear had been following their exact route sometime within the past few hours. Marcus's immediate response was to conduct a detailed examination of the overlapping tracks to determine the timing and direction of the bear's travel. His analysis indicated that the bear had been moving in the same direction they were currently traveling toward their base camp. and that the tracks had been made sometime within the past 2 to 3 hours. Most concerning was the deliberate nature of the bear's path, which showed no evidence of the meandering or foraging behavior that would typically characterize bear travel, suggesting instead purposeful movement toward a specific destination. Amanda's examination of the surrounding area revealed additional evidence that the bear had spent time investigating their morning's activities, including disturbed vegetation around the camera trap location, and what appeared to be claw marks on a nearby tree that had not been present during their morning installation work. The pattern of disturbance suggested that the bear had been systematically examining the equipment and the surrounding area, behavior that indicated curiosity about human activities rather than simple coincidental presence. David's assessment of the tactical situation identified several factors that created significant cause for concern. The bear was traveling in the same direction as their planned route back to base camp, was moving at a deliberate pace that suggested purposeful travel rather than random wandering, and had demonstrated clear interest in their research activities and equipment. Most concerning was the size of the animal, which track measurements indicated was at the upper extreme of the size range for interior Alaskan grizzlies, potentially approaching 800 pounds or more. Marcus made the decision to immediately contact the other research groups with a detailed report of their discovery, transmitting GPS coordinates and track information at 5:22 p.m. His radio transmission included a recommendation that all groups modify their return routes to avoid the path that the large bear appeared to be following, and that they consider the possibility that they were being actively tracked by an animal that had taken interest in their research activities. Sarah's response to Marcus's radio transmission reflected the gravity of the situation, as she immediately ordered her group to halt their return journey and reassess their route options. Her experience with bear behavior had taught her that bears that began following human activities often continued that behavior until they achieved some form of contact, whether aggressive or simply investigative. The size of the animal that Marcus had described, combined with its apparently purposeful behavior, created a situation that required immediate and serious response. Dr. Thornfield's assessment of Marcus's report confirmed his worst fears about the risk level they were facing, as the behavior described was consistent with a large, dominant male bear that had become interested in human activities and might be actively seeking contact. Robert's experience investigating bear attacks had taught him that this type of stalking behavior often preceded dangerous encounters, particularly when food scarcity had created stress conditions that might reduce a bear's natural wariness of humans. Elena's professional experience with wildlife photography had exposed her to similar situations where large predators had become interested in human activities, and her assessment was that they needed to take immediate action to avoid what could rapidly escalate into a dangerous confrontation. Her recommendation was that all groups should modify their return routes to avoid predictable paths and consider establishing a defensive position where they could maintain visual contact with approaching threats while having access to emergency communication equipment. At 5:25 p.m., Sarah made the decision to implement emergency protocols that had been established during their planning phase, but that none of them had expected to actually use. Her radio transmission to all team members included instructions to immediately move to the nearest elevated position with good visibility, maintain constant radio contact, and prepare for possible emergency evacuation. Sarah's assessment was that the situation had evolved beyond normal research risk levels and now required treatment as a potential emergency situation. Moose Morrison's response to Sarah's emergency radio transmission was immediate and professional, as his 30 years of flying experience in Alaska had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. His assessment of weather and visibility conditions indicated that emergency evacuation remained feasible for at least another hour, but that deteriorating light conditions would make flying operations increasingly challenging as evening progressed. Moose immediately began pre-flight preparations that would allow immediate departure if evacuation became necessary. The three research groups implemented Sarah's emergency instructions with the professional efficiency that their training and experience had developed. But the challenging terrain and deteriorating visibility created conditions where their response options were limited. Sarah's group was able to reach an elevated position that provided excellent visibility across their immediate area, but their location was approximately 2 miles from the nearest suitable landing site for emergency evacuation. Marcus's group was closer to potential evacuation sites, but was traveling through terrain that offered limited visibility and fewer defensive position options. Dr. Thornfield and Elena were in the most challenging position, as their afternoon work had taken them into an area with dense vegetation and restricted visibility that provided excellent concealment for approaching bears, but limited options for human observation and movement. Robert's immediate priority was to move his group to a position where they could maintain visual contact with potential threats while having access to multiple escape routes, but the surrounding terrain made this objective difficult to achieve rapidly. At 5:31 p.m., Marcus's group encountered the evidence that confirmed their worst fears about the situation they were facing. While moving toward higher ground in response to Sarah's emergency instructions, David spotted fresh bear scat that was still steaming in the cold air, indicating that a large bear had passed through their immediate area within the past few minutes. The size and consistency of the scat confirmed that they were dealing with the same large individual whose tracks they had been following, and the timing indicated that the bear was much closer to their location than they had previously understood. Marcus's immediate response was to order his group to form a tight defensive formation while scanning the surrounding area for visual contact with the bear. His experience with bear behavior had taught him that bears often remained in the immediate vicinity after defecating, particularly when they were investigating human activities or marking their territory in response to perceived intrusion. The steaming condition of the scat indicated that the bear could be within a few hundred yards of their current position, potentially close enough to present an immediate threat. Amanda's ranch background had taught her to remain calm during encounters with large animals, but her assessment of their current situation identified several factors that created serious cause for concern. They were in terrain that provided numerous concealment opportunities for a large bear. Visibility was decreasing rapidly as evening approached, and their distance from potential evacuation sites meant that immediate rescue would not be possible if the situation escalated. Her recommendation was that they should prioritize reaching open terrain where they could maintain visual contact with approaching threats. David's military training had prepared him for tactical situations involving potential contact with dangerous adversaries, and his assessment was that they needed to assume they were being actively tracked by a large bear that might be preparing to initiate contact. His recommendations included maintaining 360-degree observation, preparing defensive equipment for immediate use, and establishing communication protocols that would allow rapid coordination if the bear appeared. David's medical training also prompted him to review emergency medical procedures that might be needed if bear spray proved insufficient to deter an aggressive animal. Marcus transmitted an updated situation report at 5:34 p.m., informing the other research groups that they had encountered fresh sign indicating a large bear was in their immediate area and that they were implementing defensive procedures while attempting to reach more favorable terrain. His transmission included their current GPS coordinates and a request that other groups avoid their general area while maintaining constant radio monitoring for emergency communications. Sarah's response to Marcus's updated report was to order immediate implementation of their most serious emergency protocols, including activation of satellite communication equipment that would alert park rangers and emergency response agencies to their situation. Her assessment was that the combination of a large bear actively tracking their research groups, deteriorating weather and visibility conditions, and challenging terrain for evacuation created a situation that required immediate professional emergency response support. Dr. Thornfield's evaluation of the evolving situation confirmed that they were facing the type of circumstances that his experience investigating bear attacks had taught him to recognize as potentially catastrophic. The behavior patterns they were observing suggested a large, stressed bear that had become fixated on human activities and might be preparing to make contact regardless of normal deterrent measures. Robert's immediate recommendation was that all groups should prioritize reaching defensible positions and preparing for possible aggressive contact with a bear that might not respond normally to standard deterrent techniques. Elena's wildlife photography experience had exposed her to numerous encounters with large predators, but her assessment was that their current situation involved behavioral patterns that were outside the normal range for bears that had not been habituated to human contact. Her observation was that the systematic tracking behavior they were documenting suggested a bear that was making deliberate decisions about human interaction rather than simply responding to curiosity or food motivation. At 5:38 p.m., the situation that the research team had been trying to avoid finally materialized when Dr. Thornfield and Elena encountered direct visual contact with the large bear that had been tracking their activities. The animal appeared approximately 150 yards from their position, moving deliberately through a patch of low willows with its head raised and obviously aware of their presence. Robert's immediate assessment was that they were observing an adult male grizzly bear that appeared to weigh between 750 and 800 pounds, significantly larger than typical interior Alaskan bears and clearly the dominant animal in the area. The bear's behavior during the initial contact was unlike anything that Dr. Thornfield had observed during his decades of experience with bear encounters. Rather than displaying the wariness or avoidance behavior that would normally characterize bear responses to human presence, the animal was moving directly toward their position with what appeared to be deliberate intent. The bear's posture was neither overtly aggressive nor defensive, but rather suggested an animal that was investigating something of interest and was not deterred by human presence. Elena's professional photographer instincts prompted her to begin documenting the encounter despite the obvious danger, as her experience had taught her that visual evidence of bear behavior could provide crucial information for subsequent analysis and investigation. Her telephoto lenses allowed her to capture detailed images of the bear's size, condition, and behavior patterns from a relatively safe distance, documentation that would later prove essential for understanding the events that were about to unfold. Robert's immediate response to visual contact with the bear was to implement the deterrent techniques that his experience had taught him were most effective for preventing aggressive encounters. His first action was to make himself and Elena appear as large as possible, while speaking in calm, firm tones that were designed to communicate human presence without triggering aggressive responses. Robert's years of experience had taught him that the initial moments of bear-human contact were crucial for determining whether an encounter would remain peaceful or escalate into a dangerous confrontation. The bear's response to Dr. Thornfield's deterrent efforts was to pause in its approach and raise its head higher, clearly assessing the situation while maintaining its position approximately 120 yards from their location. Robert's assessment was that the bear was demonstrating unusual confidence and lack of fear, behavior that suggested either an animal that had previous experience with humans or one that was motivated by factors that overrode its natural wariness. The bear's body language indicated alertness and interest rather than fear or aggression. But Robert's experience had taught him that this type of behavior could change rapidly if the bear perceived threat or decided to investigate more closely. At 5:41 p.m., Dr. Thornfield transmitted an emergency radio message informing the other research groups that he and Elena were in direct visual contact with a large bear that was showing unusual interest in their activities. His transmission included their exact GPS coordinates, a description of the bear's size and behavior, and a recommendation that the other groups should prepare for possible bear contact while maintaining maximum distance from his location. Robert's assessment was that they were dealing with an individual bear that might be actively seeking human contact, behavior that could indicate dangerous intentions. Marcus's response to Dr. Thornfield's emergency transmission was to immediately alter his group's movement to increase their distance from Robert and Elena's location while moving toward terrain that would provide better defensive options if they encountered the bear or other animals. His experience with bear behavior had taught him that bears displaying unusual interest in human activities often continued that behavior until they achieved some form of direct contact, making it crucial for other groups to avoid predictable locations where encounters might occur. Sarah's reaction to the emergency radio transmission was to activate their satellite communication equipment and transmit a distress signal that would alert park rangers and emergency response agencies to their situation. Her message included detailed GPS coordinates for all research groups, a description of their bear encounter situation, and a request for immediate evacuation assistance. Sarah's assessment was that the situation had evolved beyond their ability to manage with available resources and now required professional emergency response intervention. Amanda Patterson's ranch background had exposed her to numerous encounters with large animals, but her assessment was that the behavior Dr. Thornfield was describing was outside the normal range for wild bears that had not been habituated to human contact. Her experience had taught her that animals displaying this type of persistent interest in human activities were often motivated by factors that made them more likely to initiate aggressive contact, particularly when other stress factors like food scarcity were present. David Kowalski's military training had included instruction in defensive procedures for encounters with dangerous wildlife, and his assessment was that their situation required immediate implementation of their most serious defensive protocols. His recommendations included ensuring that all bear spray was immediately accessible, establishing communication procedures that would allow rapid coordination between groups, and identifying terrain features that could provide defensive advantages if aggressive contact occurred. Thomas Chen's technical background had taught him to approach crisis situations with systematic analysis, and his assessment identified several factors that were combining to create an extremely dangerous situation. The size of the bear they were encountering, its unusual behavioral patterns, the challenging terrain and weather conditions, and their distance from immediate evacuation assistance created what he recognized as a potentially catastrophic combination of risk factors. At 5:44 p.m., the bear began moving again, continuing its approach toward Dr. Thornfield and Elena's position despite Robert's continued deterrent efforts. The animal's movement was deliberate and purposeful, suggesting that it had made a decision to investigate their presence more closely, regardless of their attempts to discourage contact. Robert's assessment was that they were dealing with a bear that was not responding normally to standard deterrent techniques, behavior that could indicate either habituation to human contact or motivation by factors that overrode normal wariness. Elena's continued photographic documentation captured the progression of the bear's approach, providing visual evidence of behavior patterns that wildlife experts would later analyze to understand the motivations and decision-making processes of the animal. Her images showed a bear that appeared to be in excellent physical condition, with the massive muscle development and fat reserves that characterized a dominant adult male during the pre-denning feeding period. The bear's facial expressions and body language suggested alertness and determination rather than aggression. But Elena's experience had taught her that this could change rapidly if the bear perceived threat or decided to assert dominance. Dr. Thornfield's assessment of the approaching bear identified several factors that suggested they were dealing with an exceptionally dangerous individual. The animal's size placed it at the upper extreme of the range for interior Alaskan grizzlies, while its behavior indicated an unusual lack of fear that could suggest either habituation to human contact or territorial behavior driven by stress factors. Most concerning was the bear's apparent decision to continue its approach despite deterrent efforts that would normally be effective for preventing aggressive encounters. As the bear continued its approach, closing the distance to approximately 80 yards, Robert made the decision to escalate his deterrent efforts by using noise-making devices designed to startle bears and encourage them to leave the area. His air horn produced a sharp blast that echoed across the tundra landscape, a sound that would normally cause bears to retreat rapidly from human contact. The bear's response was to pause briefly and raise its head higher, but rather than retreating, it resumed its approach after a few seconds of assessment. The bear's failure to respond to noise deterrents confirmed Dr. Thornfield's assessment that they were dealing with an individual that was not exhibiting normal bear behavior patterns. Robert's experience investigating bear attacks had taught him that bears that failed to respond to standard deterrent techniques were significantly more likely to initiate aggressive contact, particularly when other stress factors like food scarcity or territorial competition were present. His assessment was that they needed to prepare for the possibility that bear spray might be their only remaining deterrent option. At 5:47 p.m., with the bear having closed the distance to approximately 60 yards and continuing its steady approach, Dr. Thornfield made the decision to deploy bear spray as a final deterrent measure. His experience had taught him that bear spray was most effective when used at ranges of 20 to 30 feet. But the bear's persistent approach and lack of response to other deterrent measures suggested that they might not have the luxury of waiting for optimal range. Robert's assessment was that early deployment of bear spray might create a defensive barrier that would discourage the bear from continuing its approach. The bear's response to the deployment of bear spray was initially promising, as the animal paused its approach and began showing signs of discomfort from the irritating effects of the oleoresin capsicum. However, rather than retreating as would normally be expected, the bear began moving laterally while maintaining its general advance toward their position. Robert's assessment was that the bear spray had created temporary discomfort, but had not provided the decisive deterrent effect that would normally end an encounter of this type. Eleanor's documentation of the bear spray deployment captured the animal's response patterns, providing visual evidence of behavior that would later be analyzed by wildlife experts to understand why standard deterrent techniques had failed to prevent the encounter from escalating. Her images showed a bear that appeared to be experiencing discomfort from the spray, but was not allowing that discomfort to override its apparent motivation to continue investigating their presence. Dr. Thornfield's assessment of the bear's response to bear spray confirmed his worst fears about the situation they were facing, as the animal's persistence despite chemical deterrents indicated either habituation to human contact or motivation by factors that overrode normal avoidance responses. Robert's experience had taught him that bears that continued to approach after bear spray deployment were extremely likely to initiate physical contact, requiring immediate implementation of emergency evacuation procedures. At 5:49 p.m., Dr. Thornfield transmitted what would be his final routine radio communication, informing the other research groups that bear spray had been deployed without achieving decisive deterrent effects, and that the bear was continuing its approach toward their position. His transmission included instructions for the other groups to implement immediate evacuation procedures while avoiding his general area, and a request that emergency responders be informed that an aggressive bear encounter was imminent. Marcus's response to Dr. Thornfield's final transmission was to immediately begin moving his group toward the nearest potential evacuation site, while maintaining constant radio monitoring for emergency communications. His experience with bear behavior had taught him that encounters that escalated to the point of bear spray deployment often continued to escalate until some form of resolution was achieved, making it crucial for other groups to reach safety while emergency response was still possible. Sarah's reaction to the deteriorating situation was to transmit an updated emergency message via satellite communication, informing park rangers that bear spray had been deployed without success and that aggressive bear contact was imminent. Her message included specific requests for immediate helicopter evacuation assistance and medical support, as her assessment was that the situation was likely to result in serious injuries requiring immediate professional medical intervention. The bear continued its approach despite the effects of the bear spray, closing the distance to approximately 40 yards while demonstrating the size and power that made it such a formidable presence in the Denali ecosystem. Dr. Thornfield's assessment was that they were observing an animal that appeared to weigh between 750 and 800 pounds, with the massive muscle development and aggressive posture that characterized a dominant male grizzly during the pre-denning period. The bear's facial expression and body language had shifted from investigative interest to what Robert recognized as the focused attention that often preceded aggressive contact. Elena's final photographs of the approaching bear captured the moment when the animal's behavior transitioned from investigation to what appeared to be preparation for aggressive contact. Her images showed a bear with raised hackles, forward-positioned ears, and the lowered head posture that wildlife experts recognized as indicating potential aggressive intent. The photographs would later provide crucial evidence for understanding the behavioral progression that led to the encounter that was about to unfold. At 5:52 p.m., with the bear having closed to within 35 yards and showing clear signs of aggressive intent, Dr. Thornfield made the decision that would define the remainder of the encounter. Rather than continuing to retreat and potentially allowing the bear to dictate the terms of contact, Robert chose to stand his ground and prepare to use his remaining bear spray at point-blank range if the animal continued its advance. His experience investigating bear attacks had taught him that retreat often encouraged pursuit, while firm defensive postures sometimes caused bears to reconsider their aggressive intentions. The bear's response to Dr. Thornfield's defensive posture was to pause briefly at approximately 30 yards distance, clearly assessing the situation while maintaining its obvious focus on their position. Robert's assessment was that the bear was making a final decision about whether to continue its advance or withdraw, a critical moment that would determine whether the encounter remained non-contact or escalated into the type of aggressive confrontation that had been the subject of his professional investigation for decades. Elena's position slightly behind Dr. Thornfield provided her with a clear view of both the approaching bear and Robert's defensive preparations, allowing her to document the crucial moments when standard deterrent techniques either succeeded or failed to prevent aggressive bear contact. Her professional experience had taught her to continue working even in dangerous situations, as the visual evidence she was capturing might provide crucial information for preventing similar encounters in the future. The environmental conditions during these final moments of the encounter included decreasing visibility as evening shadows lengthened, dropping temperatures that enhanced scent transmission and variable wind patterns that carried human scent in unpredictable directions. These factors combined to create conditions where both humans and bears were operating with reduced sensory information, potentially contributing to the misunderstandings and miscommunications that often preceded aggressive wildlife encounters. At 5:54 p.m., the large male grizzly bear made the decision that would transform their research expedition from a routine scientific study into one of the most thoroughly documented bear attacks in Alaskan history. With a sudden burst of speed that demonstrated the explosive power that made grizzly bears such formidable predators, the animal covered the final 30 yards to Dr. Thornfield's position in approximately 4 seconds, moving with the fluid grace and terrifying purpose that characterized a bear that had committed to aggressive contact. Dr. Thornfield's final bear spray deployment occurred at a range of approximately 8 feet, close enough to ensure maximum concentration of the irritating chemicals, but also close enough that the bear's momentum carried it through the spray cloud before the deterrent effects could alter its behavior. Robert's experience had taught him that bears moving at full charge speed often continued their advance for several seconds after being sprayed, as their momentum and aggressive focus overrode immediate responses to chemical deterrents. The initial contact between the 800-pound grizzly bear and Dr. Thornfield occurred with the devastating force that had made bear attacks one of the most feared wildlife encounters in North America. The bear's first blow struck Robert in the chest with sufficient force to lift his 180-pound frame completely off the ground, launching him backward approximately 6 feet before he struck a large boulder with an impact that would later be determined to have caused multiple rib fractures and internal injuries. Elena's documentation of the initial attack captured the raw power and speed that characterized aggressive bear behavior, providing visual evidence of the forces involved in encounters that often proved fatal for human participants. Her images showed a bear moving with the coordinated power of a perfectly adapted predator while simultaneously documenting the vulnerable position of humans when confronted with such overwhelming physical force. Dr. Thornfield's impact with the boulder temporarily stunned him, but his decades of experience with dangerous wildlife had conditioned him to maintain consciousness and continue defensive actions, even while seriously injured. Robert's immediate assessment was that he had sustained significant injuries but remained capable of continued resistance, knowledge that would prove crucial for his survival during the prolonged encounter that was about to unfold. The bear's behavior following the initial contact demonstrated the complex motivations that drove aggressive encounters, as the animal did not immediately continue its attack, but instead spent several seconds investigating Dr. Thornfield's position while apparently assessing the results of its initial charge. This behavior suggested that the bear's aggression was motivated by territorial or investigative factors rather than predatory intent, a distinction that often determined whether attacked humans survived their encounters. Elena's position, approximately 20 feet from the initial contact point, provided her with a clear view of the encounter while keeping her outside the immediate focus of the bear's attention. Her decision to continue documenting the attack reflected both her professional instincts and her understanding that visual evidence of bear behavior during aggressive encounters was extremely rare and potentially valuable for future prevention efforts. Dr. Thornfield's defensive response to the bear's continued presence included remaining as motionless as possible while assessing his injuries and planning potential escape routes. Robert's experience investigating bear attacks had taught him that sudden movements often triggered renewed aggression, while passive behavior sometimes allowed bears to complete their investigation and withdraw without continuing their attack. The bear's investigation of Dr. Thornfield included sniffing and gentle manipulation with its paws, behavior that indicated curiosity rather than predatory intent, but still posed significant danger due to the animal's size and strength. Robert's assessment was that the bear was treating him as an unusual object of interest rather than prey, suggesting that defensive rather than aggressive responses might be most effective for preventing further escalation. At 5:56 p.m., the encounter entered a new phase when the bear's attention shifted to Elena's position, apparently triggered by her movement, while attempting to document the ongoing situation. The animal's response was immediate and decisive, as it abandoned its investigation of Dr. Thornfield and began moving toward Elena with the same purposeful advance that had characterized its initial approach. Elena's assessment was that she had become the bear's new focus of attention, requiring immediate defensive action to prevent a second aggressive contact. Elena's response to becoming the bear's target reflected her experience with wildlife photography in dangerous situations, as she immediately began implementing the defensive techniques that her years of fieldwork had taught her were most effective for avoiding aggressive contact with large predators. Her first action was to make herself appear as large as possible while avoiding direct eye contact that might be interpreted as challenging behavior, techniques that had proved effective during previous encounters with large mammals. The bear's approach toward Elena was more deliberate than its initial charge toward Dr. Thornfield, suggesting that it had achieved some level of satisfaction from its investigation of Robert and was now conducting a more systematic exploration of the situation. Elena's assessment was that the bear was demonstrating investigative rather than predatory behavior, but she understood that the distinction was largely academic given the animal's size and demonstrated willingness to make physical contact. Dr. Thornfield's position allowed him to observe the bear's approach toward Elena while assessing his own condition and planning potential intervention strategies. Robert's evaluation was that he had sustained serious but not immediately life-threatening injuries, including multiple rib fractures and possible internal bleeding, but that he retained sufficient mobility to potentially assist Elena if the situation required it. His experience had taught him that bear attacks often involved multiple contacts with different individuals, requiring coordinated defensive responses from all potential targets. Elena's decision to continue documenting the encounter while implementing defensive procedures reflected her understanding that visual evidence of extended bear-human interactions was extremely rare and potentially valuable for scientific analysis. Her professional experience had taught her to maintain focus on her work, even in dangerous situations, skills that allowed her to capture unprecedented footage of bear behavior during aggressive encounters. The bear's investigation of Elena began with the same sniffing and gentle manipulation that had characterized its interaction with Dr. Thornfield, suggesting that it was conducting systematic exploration of human presence rather than random aggressive behavior. Elena's assessment was that the bear was treating both humans as objects of curiosity rather than threats or prey, behavior that offered hope for eventual disengagement if proper defensive techniques were maintained. At 5:58 p.m., approximately 4 minutes after the initial contact, the bear's behavior began to shift in ways that suggested it was preparing to conclude its investigation and withdraw from the encounter. The animal's posture relaxed slightly, and its attention began to wander from the immediate area where Elena and Dr. Thornfield were located to the broader surrounding environment. Elena's assessment was that the bear was beginning to lose interest in human contact and might be preparing to resume its normal activities. Dr. Thornfield's observation of the bear's changing behavior patterns suggested that the encounter was entering the resolution phase that characterized most non-predatory bear attacks, where the animal's curiosity was satisfied and it began seeking to disengage from human contact. Robert's experience had taught him that this phase was crucial for determining the ultimate outcome of aggressive encounters, as improper human responses could trigger renewed aggression even when bears were preparing to withdraw. Elena's continued documentation of the bear's behavior during the disengagement phase captured subtle changes in posture and attention that provided insights into the decision-making processes of large predators during encounters with humans. Her images showed a bear that appeared to be gradually losing interest in human contact while maintaining awareness of their presence, behavior that suggested successful implementation of defensive techniques designed to encourage withdrawal rather than continued aggression. The bear's final investigation of the encounter area included a systematic examination of equipment and personal items that had been scattered during the initial contact, behavior that demonstrated the animal's intelligence and curiosity about human artifacts. Dr. Thornfield's assessment was that the bear was conducting a thorough exploration of human presence in its territory, gathering information that might influence its future responses to similar encounters. At 6:01 p.m., 7 minutes after the initial contact, the large male grizzly bear began moving away from Elena and Dr. Thornfield's position, walking with the deliberate pace that characterized normal bear travel rather than the focused advance that had marked its initial approach. The animal's departure was gradual rather than sudden, suggesting that it was voluntarily concluding its investigation rather than responding to immediate threats or deterrent pressure. Elena's documentation of the bear's withdrawal captured the moment when the encounter transitioned from active aggression to passive disengagement, providing visual evidence of behavioral patterns that were crucial for understanding how aggressive bear encounters could be resolved without fatal outcomes. Her images showed a bear that appeared satisfied with its investigation and was resuming normal activities rather than maintaining aggressive focus on human presence. Dr. Thornfield's assessment of his injuries during the bear's withdrawal indicated that he had sustained multiple rib fractures, possible internal bleeding, and various lacerations, but that none of his injuries appeared to be immediately life-threatening if prompt medical attention could be obtained. Robert's experience with bear attack investigations had taught him to conduct systematic injury assessment even while emergency situations were ongoing, skills that proved valuable for determining appropriate medical response priorities. Elena's evaluation of her own condition revealed that she had escaped physical injury during the encounter, although the psychological impact of direct contact with an aggressive grizzly bear would require significant time and professional support to process fully. Her professional experience with dangerous wildlife had provided some preparation for this type of encounter, but the intensity and duration of direct contact exceeded anything she had previously experienced. At 6:03 p.m., with the bear having moved approximately 100 yards from their position and showing no signs of renewed interest in human contact, Dr. Thornfield transmitted the first radio communication since the encounter began, informing the other research groups that the bear attack was concluded and that immediate medical evacuation was required for serious but non-life-threatening injuries. His transmission included their exact GPS coordinates and a preliminary assessment of his medical condition for emergency response planning. Marcus's response to Dr. Thornfield's emergency transmission was immediate and professional, as his group began moving toward Robert and Elena's position while maintaining vigilance for the bear that had just concluded its aggressive encounter. Marcus's experience with bear behavior had taught him that bears often remained in the general area following aggressive encounters, requiring continued caution even after initial contact had ended. Sarah's reaction to news that the bear attack was concluded was to immediately coordinate emergency medical response while ensuring that evacuation procedures could be implemented safely without triggering renewed bear activity. Her transmission to emergency responders included detailed medical information and GPS coordinates that would allow rapid location and evacuation of the injured team member. Amanda Patterson's medical training while limited to basic first aid, prompted her to begin organizing medical supplies that might be needed to stabilize Dr. Thornfield's injuries during evacuation procedures. Her assessment was that rib fractures and internal bleeding required immediate professional medical attention, but that appropriate first aid could help prevent deterioration of his condition during transport to medical facilities. David Kowalski's military medical training made him the most qualified team member to provide emergency medical care for Dr. Thornfield's injuries, and his immediate response was to coordinate with Marcus's group to reach the attack site as rapidly as possible while maintaining security against continued bear activity. David's assessment was that prompt medical intervention could significantly improve outcomes for the types of injuries typically sustained during bear attacks. Thomas Chen's technical background prompted him to begin documenting precise timing and GPS coordinates for all aspects of the encounter and subsequent response, information that would be crucial for subsequent investigation and analysis. His systematic approach to data collection continued even during emergency situations, providing valuable documentation for understanding both the encounter itself and the effectiveness of emergency response procedures. Moose Morrison's response to the emergency situation was to immediately begin pre-flight preparations for medical evacuation, including coordination with emergency medical services and identification of optimal landing sites near the attack location. His experience with emergency evacuations in remote Alaskan locations had taught him that rapid response often determined outcomes for seriously injured individuals in wilderness settings. At 6:07 p.m., Marcus's group reached Dr. Thornfield and Elena's position, allowing David Kowalski to begin systematic medical assessment and emergency treatment of Robert's injuries. David's examination confirmed multiple rib fractures on the left side, possible internal bleeding evidenced by abdominal tenderness and discoloration, and various lacerations and contusions consistent with bear attack injuries. His assessment was that immediate evacuation was required, but that Robert's condition was stable enough to survive transport if appropriate medical support was maintained. David's emergency medical treatment focused on stabilizing Dr. Thornfield's condition for evacuation, including pain management, monitoring for signs of internal bleeding, and immobilization techniques designed to prevent further injury during transport. His military medical training had included specific instruction in treating trauma injuries under field conditions, skills that proved directly applicable to managing bear attack injuries in remote wilderness settings. Elena's debriefing with Marcus and Amanda provided crucial information about the encounter's progression and the bear's behavior patterns, data that would be essential for subsequent investigation and analysis. Her detailed account of the bear's approach, contact, and withdrawal provided insights into the motivations and decision-making processes that had driven the encounter, information that could help prevent similar incidents in the future. Marcus's assessment of the attack site revealed extensive physical evidence of the encounter, including disturbed vegetation, scattered equipment, and clear bear tracks that documented the animal's movements during the aggressive contact. His systematic documentation of the scene provided evidence that would support subsequent investigation by wildlife authorities and help determine whether the bear posed continued threats to human safety. Amanda's examination of Elena's condition confirmed that she had escaped physical injury during the encounter, but her assessment included recognition that psychological trauma from direct bear contact often required professional support for complete recovery. Amanda's experience with large animals had taught her that surviving dangerous encounters often created lasting psychological effects that needed appropriate treatment, even when physical injuries were minimal. At 6:15 p.m., Moose Morrison's aircraft appeared overhead, having launched from a nearby landing strip as soon as emergency communications had indicated that medical evacuation was required. His assessment of landing conditions near the attack site identified a suitable area approximately 300 yards from Dr. Thornfield's position, requiring a challenging but feasible evacuation transport across rough terrain. Moose's experience with emergency landings in challenging conditions had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. The medical evacuation process required careful coordination between ground personnel and aircraft operations, as Dr. Thornfield's injuries made movement potentially dangerous, while the proximity of the aggressive bear required continued security vigilance. David Kowalski's medical training enabled him to supervise the evacuation transport while monitoring Robert's condition for signs of deterioration that might require additional emergency intervention. Dr. Thornfield's transport to the aircraft was accomplished using improvised stretcher techniques that David's military training had taught him, combined with careful attention to spinal immobilization and pain management that helped prevent additional injury during movement across rough terrain. The 300-yard distance required approximately 20 minutes to traverse safely, during which Robert remained conscious and responsive, despite his significant injuries. Elena's evacuation alongside Dr. Thornfield reflected both her psychological need for immediate removal from the attack site and the practical requirement for witness debriefing by emergency responders. Her documentation of the encounter would prove crucial for subsequent investigation, while her first-hand account would provide insights into bear behavior that were impossible to obtain through physical evidence alone. Moose Morrison's takeoff from the improvised landing site demonstrated the skill and experience that had made him one of Alaska's most respected bush pilots, as he successfully launched from a rough terrain site while carrying injured passengers who required smooth flight conditions to prevent additional trauma. His flight to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital covered 127 miles and required 43 minutes under challenging weather conditions that were rapidly deteriorating as evening progressed. At 6:58 p.m., Dr. Thornfield and Eleanor arrived at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, where emergency medical personnel had been prepared for bear attack injuries based on radio communications from the evacuation aircraft. Robert's immediate treatment included comprehensive trauma assessment, pain management, and diagnostic imaging to determine the extent of internal injuries sustained during the encounter. The emergency medical team's initial assessment confirmed David Kowalski's field diagnosis of multiple rib fractures and possible internal bleeding, while additional examination revealed a punctured lung that required immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Thornfield's condition was classified as serious but stable, with good prospects for complete recovery if appropriate medical treatment continued without complications. Elena's medical examination revealed no physical injuries from the bear encounter, but emergency personnel noted signs of psychological trauma that would require follow-up counseling and support services. Her detailed account of the encounter provided medical staff with crucial information about the mechanism of Dr. Thornfield's injuries, data that helped guide treatment decisions and prognosis assessments. The remaining research team members faced the challenge of securing their base camp and equipment while ensuring their own safety in an area where a large bear had recently demonstrated aggressive behavior toward humans. Marcus's assessment was that they needed to maintain vigilant security while completing necessary camp closure activities, as the bear might return to investigate their continued presence in its territory. Sarah's decision-making regarding the continuation of their research expedition reflected the reality that the bear attack had fundamentally altered the risk environment in their study area, making it inappropriate to continue normal research activities until the aggressive bear's status could be determined. Her assessment was that immediate evacuation of all personnel and equipment was required to ensure team safety, while allowing wildlife authorities to investigate the encounter and determine appropriate management responses. Amanda Patterson's role in securing research equipment and data reflected her understanding that their expedition's scientific value depended on preserving the information they had collected, even though the bear encounter had prevented completion of their planned research activities. Her systematic approach to equipment recovery ensured that valuable scientific data would be available for analysis despite the premature termination of their fieldwork. Thomas Chen's documentation of the entire expedition, including detailed records of the bear encounter and subsequent emergency response, provided valuable information for subsequent investigation and analysis. His technical background had conditioned him to maintain systematic data collection even during emergency situations, skills that produced comprehensive documentation of events that were crucial for understanding both the encounter itself and the effectiveness of emergency response procedures. David Kowalski's assessment of the team's medical status confirmed that no other team members had sustained injuries during the encounter, but his evaluation included recognition that psychological impacts from witnessing aggressive bear behavior often required professional support for complete processing. His military experience with traumatic events had taught him to monitor team members for delayed stress reactions that might emerge hours or days after initial incidents. The evacuation of the remaining research team and their equipment required a second flight by Moose Morrison, who returned to the attack site after delivering Dr. Thornfield and Elena to medical care. His assessment was that weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate, making immediate evacuation essential for preventing the team from becoming stranded in an area where bear activity posed continued risks to human safety. Marcus's final assessment of the attack site included documentation of physical evidence that would be crucial for subsequent investigation by wildlife authorities. His systematic examination of bear tracks, disturbed vegetation, and scattered equipment provided a comprehensive record of the encounter that would help investigators understand the bear's behavior and determine whether it posed continued threats to human safety. Sarah's coordination with park authorities and emergency responders ensured that appropriate agencies were informed of the bear encounter and its location, enabling rapid implementation of public safety measures that would protect other visitors to the area. Her detailed incident reports provided officials with the information they needed to make informed decisions about area closures and bear management responses. At 8:23 p.m., the final evacuation flight departed the research site, carrying the remaining team members and their essential equipment to safety in Fairbanks. Moose Morrison's successful completion of this evacuation operation under deteriorating weather conditions demonstrated the professional skill and dedication that had made him the preferred pilot for research expeditions throughout interior Alaska. The bear encounter site was left undisturbed except for essential safety measures, allowing wildlife authorities to conduct thorough investigation of physical evidence without contamination from additional human activity. This approach would prove crucial for subsequent analysis of the bear's behavior and the factors that had contributed to the aggressive encounter. Dr. Thornfield's surgical treatment at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital was completed successfully during the evening hours, with procedures to repair his punctured lung and stabilize his rib fractures. His medical team's assessment was that complete recovery was expected within 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no complications developed during the healing process. Robert's experience with bear attack injuries had prepared him mentally for the recovery process, while his professional knowledge helped him understand the medical procedures and prognosis. Elena's psychological evaluation and initial counseling sessions began immediately upon her arrival at the hospital, reflecting medical staff's understanding that traumatic wildlife encounters often created lasting psychological effects that required prompt professional intervention. Her photographer's training in observing and documenting dangerous situations had provided some preparation for traumatic events, but the intensity and personal nature of the bear encounter exceeded her previous experience significantly. The initial investigation by Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel began immediately upon notification of the bear encounter, with wildlife specialists dispatched to the attack site to assess physical evidence and determine the bear's current location and behavior patterns. Their preliminary assessment would determine whether immediate action was required to protect public safety or whether the bear could be allowed to continue normal activities without posing unacceptable risks to humans. Marcus Rodriguez's detailed debriefing with wildlife authorities provided crucial information about the bear's behavior before, during, and after the aggressive encounter. His professional expertise in bear behavior allowed him to provide insights into the animal's motivations and decision-making processes that were essential for understanding whether the encounter represented normal territorial behavior or unusual aggression that might indicate ongoing threats to human safety. Sarah Winters' coordination with university officials and research sponsors ensured that appropriate notifications were made regarding the incident and its impact on their research program. Her assessment was that the scientific value of their expedition had been significantly enhanced by the detailed documentation of bear behavior they had obtained, even though the aggressive encounter had prevented completion of their original research objectives. The media response to news of the bear encounter began within hours of the incident, as local news organizations learned of the emergency medical evacuation and began requesting information about the circumstances and outcomes. Sarah's decision to coordinate all media communications through university officials helped ensure that accurate information was provided while protecting the privacy and recovery needs of the affected team members. Amanda Patterson's preliminary analysis of the botanical and environmental data they had collected suggested that food scarcity and environmental stress had indeed contributed to the unusual bear behavior they had documented. Her findings indicated that drought conditions and early frost had significantly reduced traditional food sources, potentially forcing bears to expand their territories and increasing the likelihood of human encounters. Thomas Chen's technical analysis of the camera trap footage they had retrieved provided visual evidence of bear behavior in the area prior to the aggressive encounter. His preliminary review of the footage revealed multiple large bears using the area as a travel corridor, supporting their hypothesis that they had been working in a region with higher than normal bear density and activity levels. David Kowalski's medical assessment of the expedition's emergency response procedures identified several factors that had contributed to the successful outcome of the bear encounter, including proper equipment preparation, effective communication protocols, and prompt medical evacuation. His military experience with emergency situations had taught him to conduct systematic analysis of both successful and unsuccessful elements of crisis response procedures. The Alaska State Troopers' investigation of the incident focused on determining whether any regulatory violations or safety protocol failures had contributed to the bear encounter. Their preliminary assessment was that the research team had followed appropriate safety procedures and that the encounter appeared to represent normal risks associated with scientific work in prime bear habitat during the pre-denning feeding period. Moose Morrison's aircraft underwent thorough inspection following the emergency evacuation flights, as his rapid response and challenging landing conditions had subjected the plane to stresses beyond normal operating parameters. His maintenance assessment confirmed that the aircraft had performed flawlessly during the emergency operations, validating his decision to launch immediate evacuation flights despite deteriorating weather conditions. The National Park Service's response to the bear encounter included immediate closure of the affected area to visitor access, while wildlife specialists conducted thorough investigation of the incident and assessment of continued bear activity. Their preliminary assessment was that the encounter represented normal territorial behavior by a large male bear during the pre-denning period, but that continued monitoring was required to ensure public safety. Dr. Thornfield's recovery during the first 24 hours following surgery was complicated by pneumonia development related to his punctured lung injury, requiring extended hospitalization and intensive medical support. His medical team's assessment was that this complication was not unusual for bear attack injuries and that his overall prognosis remained positive with appropriate treatment. Robert's experience investigating bear attacks had prepared him for the possibility of complications during recovery, helping him maintain perspective during challenging medical procedures. Elena's initial psychological recovery was supported by specialized counselors experienced in treating wildlife attack trauma, as her experience with the bear encounter had created specific types of stress reactions that required expert intervention. Her artistic background and professional experience with dangerous situations provided some resilience during the recovery process, but the intensity of direct bear contact had created psychological challenges that required systematic professional support. The research team's debriefing process extended over several days as investigators worked to develop a comprehensive understanding of the factors that had contributed to the bear encounter. Their systematic analysis of equipment, procedures, environmental conditions, and human factors would provide valuable information for improving safety protocols for future research expeditions in similar environments. Marcus Rodriguez's detailed analysis of bear sign and behavior patterns documented during their expedition provided crucial scientific data about the relationship between environmental stress and bear behavior. His findings suggested that climate-related changes in food availability were indeed forcing bears to alter their traditional behavior patterns in ways that increased the likelihood of human encounters. Sarah Winters's coordination with insurance companies and liability assessments ensured that appropriate coverage was available for medical expenses and equipment losses related to the bear encounter. Her experience with research expedition planning had included comprehensive insurance preparation, provisions that proved essential for managing the financial impacts of the emergency situation. The scientific community's response to news of the bear encounter included offers of support for continuing the research using alternative methods that would reduce human exposure to dangerous wildlife. Several colleagues proposed collaborative approaches that would allow completion of the research objectives using remote monitoring techniques and analysis of data already collected during the expedition. Amanda Patterson's family's reaction to news of her involvement in a bear encounter reflected the concerns that many families experience when loved ones pursue careers involving dangerous wildlife. Her parents' initial fears were balanced by pride in her professional competence and relief that she had escaped physical injury during the incident. Amanda's explanation of safety protocols and emergency procedures helped reassure her family that appropriate precautions had been taken throughout the expedition. Thomas Chen's parents' response to news of the bear encounter included both concern for his safety and pride in his professional participation in significant wildlife research. Their engineering backgrounds helped them understand the systematic approach to risk management that had been implemented during the expedition, while their immigrant experience had taught them to value the educational opportunities that Thomas was pursuing despite inherent dangers. David Kowalski's military colleagues' assessment of his emergency medical response during the bear encounter was overwhelmingly positive, as his performance under pressure had demonstrated the value of military medical training for civilian emergency situations. His transition from military to civilian careers was validated by his ability to apply specialized skills in life-threatening situations that required immediate professional competence. The subsequent investigation by wildlife authorities revealed that the bear involved in the encounter was a previously unknown individual that had not been tagged or monitored by park management systems. Physical evidence from the attack site indicated an animal weighing approximately 780 pounds, placing it among the largest grizzly bears documented in the interior Alaska region. DNA samples collected from claw marks and hair samples would provide additional information about the bear's genetics and potential relationships to other bears in the area. The environmental analysis conducted following the bear encounter confirmed Amanda Patterson's preliminary assessment that food scarcity had indeed contributed to unusual bear behavior in the region. Detailed botanical surveys revealed that berry production was down by 64% compared to historical averages, while nut and seed availability was reduced by 71%. These conditions would have forced bears to expand their foraging ranges significantly, increasing the likelihood of encounters with human activities. Dr. Thornfield's medical recovery progressed steadily following resolution of his pneumonia complications, with his surgical team optimistic about complete restoration of respiratory function and normal activity levels. His experience with bear attack injuries had prepared him mentally for the recovery process, while his professional knowledge helped him understand the medical procedures and collaborate effectively with his treatment team. Robert's detailed documentation of his own recovery process would provide valuable information for treating future bear attack victims. Elena's psychological recovery included both individual counseling and group therapy sessions with other wildlife attack survivors, as her experience had created specific types of trauma reactions that were best addressed through specialized treatment approaches. Her artistic background provided some therapeutic outlets for processing the emotional impacts of the encounter, while her professional photography work offered potential avenues for converting traumatic experience into educational and conservation messaging. The insurance investigation of the incident focused on determining whether appropriate safety protocols had been followed and whether the bear encounter represented normal risks associated with scientific research in prime wildlife habitat. Their assessment confirmed that the research team had implemented industry-standard safety procedures and that the encounter fell within the range of anticipated risks for this type of scientific work. The University of Alaska's administrative response to the bear encounter included comprehensive review of safety protocols for research expeditions and development of enhanced procedures for future work in high-risk wildlife areas. Their assessment was that the incident had been handled professionally by all involved parties, and that lessons learned could be incorporated into improved safety training for future expeditions. Marcus Rodriguez's professional reputation within the scientific community was enhanced by his systematic documentation of bear behavior and his professional response during the emergency situation. His detailed analysis of the factors that had contributed to the encounter provided valuable insights for the broader research community, while his emergency response demonstrated the type of field expertise that was essential for conducting research in dangerous environments. Sarah Winters's leadership during the crisis was recognized by her colleagues and university administrators as exemplifying the type of professional competence required for conducting research in challenging and potentially dangerous environments. Her systematic approach to risk management and emergency response had contributed significantly to the successful outcome of a potentially catastrophic situation. The scientific publications that resulted from the expedition's research included unprecedented documentation of bear behavior under stress conditions, data that provided valuable insights into the relationship between environmental change and wildlife behavior. The bear encounter itself became a case study in emergency response procedures and risk management for research expeditions in dangerous wildlife habitats. Amanda Patterson's doctoral research was significantly enhanced by the data collected during the expedition, including detailed documentation of the relationship between food scarcity and bear behavior that would not have been possible to obtain under normal circumstances. Her analysis of environmental factors that contributed to the bear encounter provided important insights into the impacts of climate change on wildlife behavior patterns. Thomas Chen's technical contributions to the expedition's success were recognized through his systematic documentation of equipment performance and emergency procedures under extreme conditions. His engineering background had provided valuable perspectives on system reliability and redundancy that had contributed to the successful outcome of the emergency situation. David Kowalski's military medical training proved invaluable for managing the medical emergency aspects of the bear encounter, demonstrating the value of diverse professional backgrounds for research team composition. His transition from military to civilian careers was validated by his ability to apply specialized skills in life-threatening situations that required immediate professional competence. The long-term monitoring of the bear involved in the encounter revealed that it continued to exhibit normal behavior patterns following the incident, suggesting that the aggressive contact had been motivated by territorial rather than predatory factors. Wildlife authorities concluded that the bear did not pose unusual threats to human safety and allowed it to remain in its natural habitat without intervention. The media coverage of the bear encounter emphasized both the professional competence of the research team and the inherent dangers associated with wildlife research in remote environments. The coverage helped raise public awareness about the challenges faced by scientists studying climate change impacts on wildlife behavior, while highlighting the importance of proper safety protocols for research expeditions. The legal assessment of the incident concluded that no liability existed for any party involved in the expedition, as appropriate safety procedures had been followed and the bear encounter represented normal risks associated with scientific research in prime wildlife habitat. This conclusion was important for establishing precedents for future research expeditions and insurance coverage for similar activities. Dr. Thornfield's return to active professional duties occurred approximately 10 weeks following the bear encounter, with complete restoration of his physical capabilities and no lasting effects from his injuries. His experience as a bear attack victim provided additional insights into the recovery process that enhanced his ability to assist other attack survivors and improved his understanding of the psychological impacts of wildlife encounters. Elena's recovery process extended over several months, but she ultimately returned to professional wildlife photography with enhanced appreciation for safety protocols and risk management. Her documentation of the bear encounter became an important educational resource for understanding bear behavior and promoting safety awareness among outdoor professionals and recreational users of bear habitat. The research team's reunion 6 months following the bear encounter provided an opportunity for reflection on the professional and personal impacts of their shared experience. Their collective assessment was that the expedition had been successful in achieving its scientific objectives while providing valuable lessons about risk management and emergency response that would benefit future research efforts. The scientific legacy of the expedition included not only the valuable data about bear behavior and environmental impacts that had been collected, but also important advances in safety protocols and emergency procedures for research in dangerous wildlife habitats. The systematic documentation of the bear encounter provided a case study that would be used for training future researchers and improving safety standards throughout the scientific community. Marcus Rodriguez continued his career in wildlife research with enhanced expertise in bear behavior and risk assessment, while his experience during the expedition established him as a leading authority on human-bear encounters and safety protocols. His scientific publications about the expedition's findings contributed significantly to understanding the relationship between environmental change and wildlife behavior. Sarah Winter's career was enhanced by her demonstrated leadership during the crisis and her contributions to improving safety protocols for research expeditions. Her systematic approach to risk management became a model for other research leaders, while her scientific findings about bear behavior provided important insights into wildlife adaptation to environmental change. The institutional changes implemented by universities and research organizations following the bear encounter included enhanced safety training requirements, improved communication protocols, and upgraded emergency equipment standards for research expeditions in dangerous wildlife habitats. These changes helped ensure that future researchers would benefit from the lessons learned during this expedition. The conservation implications of the expedition's findings included important insights into the impacts of climate change on bear behavior and the increasing likelihood of human-wildlife encounters as environmental conditions forced animals to alter their traditional behavior patterns. These findings contributed to policy discussions about wildlife management and human safety in areas experiencing rapid environmental change. The technological advances in emergency communication and evacuation procedures that were tested during the expedition provided valuable data about equipment performance under extreme conditions. The successful use of satellite communication devices and emergency medical procedures contributed to improvements in safety equipment and protocols for future research expeditions. The psychological support systems that were developed for treating wildlife attack trauma based on Elena's recovery experience provided important resources for other attack survivors and helped establish specialized treatment approaches for this type of trauma. Her recovery process contributed to understanding the long-term impacts of wildlife encounters and the most effective therapeutic interventions. The insurance industry's assessment of the expedition's risk management procedures led to development of improved coverage options for research expeditions and better understanding of the relationship between safety protocols and liability exposure. The successful outcome of the emergency situation, despite serious injuries, demonstrated the value of comprehensive preparation and professional emergency response. The educational impact of the expedition extended far beyond the immediate scientific community, as the detailed documentation of the bear encounter became an important resource for training outdoor professionals, park rangers, and recreational users of bear habitat. The systematic analysis of factors that contributed to the encounter and its successful resolution provided valuable lessons for anyone working or recreating in dangerous wildlife areas. Dr. Thornfield's continued work in bear attack investigation was enhanced by his personal experience as an attack survivor, providing him with unique insights into both the immediate and long-term impacts of bear encounters. His professional expertise was enriched by first-hand understanding of the psychological and physical challenges faced by attack survivors during their recovery process. The collaborative relationships that developed among team members during the expedition continued long after their return to normal professional activities, creating a network of researchers with shared experience in managing extreme situations and conducting research in dangerous environments. Their collective expertise became a valuable resource for planning and conducting future research expeditions in similar environments. The funding agency's assessment of the expedition's outcomes included recognition that the valuable scientific data collected had been obtained at significant personal cost to the researchers involved, while the successful emergency response had demonstrated the importance of adequate preparation and safety equipment. Their support for continued research in dangerous environments was balanced by requirements for enhanced safety protocols and emergency preparedness. The international scientific community's response to the expedition's findings included recognition that the relationship between environmental change and wildlife behavior was becoming increasingly important for understanding ecosystem dynamics and human safety considerations. The detailed documentation of bear behavior under stress conditions provided valuable comparative data for researchers studying similar issues in other geographical regions. The long-term follow-up studies conducted in the area where the bear encounter occurred revealed continued high levels of bear activity and ongoing food scarcity conditions that supported the expedition's findings about environmental stress and wildlife behavior. These studies confirmed that the encounter had been part of a broader pattern of environmental change and wildlife adaptation, rather than an isolated incident. The professional development opportunities that resulted from the expedition's documentation of emergency procedures and risk management included training programs for researchers, safety officers, and emergency responders working in dangerous wildlife environments. The systematic analysis of successful emergency response provided valuable case study material for improving safety training and protocol development. The personal relationships that developed among team members during their shared experience of the bear encounter created lasting bonds that extended beyond their professional collaborations. Their mutual support during the recovery process and continued friendship demonstrated the positive human connections that could develop even from traumatic shared experiences when managed with appropriate professional and personal support. The expedition's legacy ultimately extended far beyond its original scientific objectives, providing valuable insights into wildlife behavior, environmental change, emergency response procedures, risk management, and human resilience in the face of dangerous situations. The systematic documentation of all aspects of the expedition, from initial planning through long-term recovery, created a comprehensive resource that continued to benefit researchers, safety professionals, and policymakers working on issues related to human-wildlife interactions and scientific research in dangerous environments. The story of the Denali bear encounter became an important case study in the successful management of extreme risk situations, demonstrating that appropriate preparation, professional competence, and systematic emergency response could enable researchers to survive and learn from even the most dangerous wildlife encounters. The courage and professionalism demonstrated by all team members provided an inspiring example of how scientists could continue their vital work of understanding environmental change and wildlife behavior, despite the inherent dangers involved in studying these crucial issues in their natural settings. The next stories, The Last Light of Churchill. The wind screamed across the frozen tundra of Churchill, Manitoba, carrying with it the promise of death that December morning. Henry Weston pressed his face against the frost-covered window of their rented cabin, watching the pale sun struggle against the endless white horizon. Behind him, his wife Laura was making breakfast while their children, Emma, 11, and Samuel, 9, argued over a deck of cards at the rough-hewn wooden table. "Dad, can we see the polar bears today?" Emma asked, her voice bright with the kind of excitement that only children possess when faced with the unknown. She'd been talking about this trip for months, ever since Henry had surprised the family with the wilderness vacation booking last spring. Henry Michael Weston, 42 years old, was a systems analyst from Minneapolis who had spent the better part of his adult life staring at computer screens in climate-controlled offices. This trip to Churchill represented everything he thought his family needed: adventure, togetherness, and a break from the digital world that had consumed their lives. He had researched extensively, reading every blog post and travel guide about polar bear viewing in Churchill. What he hadn't anticipated was how utterly isolated they would feel in this rented cabin, 23 miles northeast of Churchill proper, accessible only by a narrow ice road that the rental company assured him was perfectly safe for December travel. Laura Elizabeth Weston, 39, had initially resisted the idea of spending their Christmas vacation in sub-Arctic Canada. A pediatric nurse at Minneapolis Children's Hospital, she preferred vacations that involved room service and heated pools. But Henry's enthusiasm had been infectious, and she found herself caught up in his vision of a real family adventure. She had spent weeks researching cold weather gear, reading about hypothermia prevention, and studying maps of the Churchill area. Now, standing in the small kitchenette of their cabin, stirring powdered eggs in a cast-iron pan, she wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. The cabin itself was a sturdy structure, built in the 1970s by a hunting outfitter named Garrett Mackenzie, who had since retired to Florida but still owned the property. Mackenzie had assured Henry over the phone that the cabin was bear-proof, equipped with reinforced doors, metal shutters, and a radio system for emergencies. What Mackenzie hadn't mentioned was that the radio had been acting up lately, producing nothing but static when Henry tried to use it the previous evening. Emma Margaret Weston was the family's natural leader, despite being only 11. A sixth grader at Jefferson Elementary in Minneapolis, she excelled in science and had read everything she could find about polar bears before the trip. She knew that adult males could weigh up to 1,500 pounds, that they were excellent swimmers, and that they were considered one of the few animals that would actively hunt humans. This knowledge thrilled rather than frightened her, and she had been keeping a detailed journal of their trip, complete with sketches of the landscape and notes about animal tracks she had spotted. Samuel David Weston, 9 years old, was quieter than his sister, but possessed an intuitive understanding of his environment that often surprised adults. He had noticed things about their surroundings that the others had missed. The way the wind carried different sounds depending on its direction, the strange absence of birds near their cabin, and the peculiar tracks in the snow that didn't match any of the animals in Emma's reference books. Samuel attended Roosevelt Elementary in Minneapolis and was known for his artistic abilities, though he had been unusually subdued since their arrival 2 days earlier. The weather on that December 29th morning was particularly harsh, even by Churchill standards. The temperature had dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and the wind was gusting up to 45 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that made prolonged outdoor exposure potentially fatal within minutes. The nearest neighbor was Marcus Ironbear, a Cree elder who lived in a small cabin approximately 4 miles southeast of the Westons' location. Ironbear, 73 years old, had been born in the area and had spent his entire life learning to read the subtle signs that the land provided about weather, wildlife, and danger. Earlier that morning, at approximately 5:47 a.m., Ironbear had been awakened by something that troubled him deeply. He had spent decades listening to the sounds of the wilderness, and this morning brought a quality of silence that he recognized as ominous. The usual sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush were absent, as were the calls of ravens that typically announced the dawn. Most concerning was the presence of tracks he had discovered around his cabin, tracks that belonged to a large male polar bear moving in a deliberate pattern that suggested hunting behavior rather than simple foraging. The bear in question was a massive specimen, approximately 14 years old and weighing close to 1,200 pounds. Wildlife biologists would later designate him as Bear MB 341, part of the western Hudson Bay polar bear population that had been monitored intermittently since 2019. MB 341 had been tagged as a juvenile in 2015, but the tracking collar had failed in 2021, leaving researchers without data on his movements or behavior patterns. What they didn't know was that MB341 had developed an unusual association between human structures and food sources, likely stemming from encounters with improperly secured garbage around Churchill. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a polar bear researcher with Polar Bears International, had been tracking the general movements of bears in the area throughout December. Her research station, located in Churchill proper, had recorded an unusually high number of bear sightings near human settlements over the previous 2 weeks. Morrison, 45 years old and a veteran of Arctic research, had sent out warnings to local authorities about increased bear activity, but the remote location of the western cabin meant that these warnings had never reached them. The morning routine at the western cabin proceeded normally, despite the harsh conditions outside. Henry had awakened at 6:15 a.m. and spent 20 minutes trying to coax heat from the temperamental wood stove that provided their primary heat source. The cabin's insulation was adequate, but the extreme cold made it necessary to maintain a constant fire to keep the interior temperature above freezing. Laura had risen at 6:45 a.m. and immediately began checking on the children, both of whom were sleeping in the cabin's single bedroom while their parents used sleeping bags in the main living area. The cabin's layout was simple but functional, consisting of a main room that served as kitchen, dining and living area, a single bedroom and a small bathroom with a chemical toilet. The front door was solid oak with metal reinforcement, as Mackenzie had promised, but the lock was a simple deadbolt that could be turned from inside. Windows were double-paned but not particularly large, designed more for insulation than for viewing. The cabin sat on a slight rise, approximately 200 yards from the shore of Hudson Bay, with sparse vegetation consisting mainly of stunted willows and areas of exposed tundra. At 7:23 a.m., Samuel was the first to notice something unusual. While Emma and Laura discussed the day's planned activities, Samuel stood at the front window, studying the landscape with the focused attention that characterized his personality. What he saw made him step back from the window with a sharp intake of breath. "Dad," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying a note that made Henry immediately stop his conversation with Laura. "There's something big moving out there." Henry joined his son at the window, peering through the frost patterns that had formed on the glass overnight. At first, he saw nothing but the endless white expanse, broken only by scattered patches of dark vegetation. Then, approximately 300 yards to the northwest, he detected movement, a yellowish-white form moving with purpose across the snow. "It's a polar bear," Henry whispered, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was what they had come to see, but the bear's proximity to their cabin was unexpected. According to everything he had read, bears typically avoided human structures unless attracted by food sources. Laura and Emma quickly joined them at the window, and for several minutes the family watched in fascination as the bear moved across their field of vision. The animal was clearly visible despite the distance, its massive size evident even at several hundred yards. Emma immediately began sketching in her journal, trying to capture the bear's appearance and behavior. "Look how it's moving," Emma observed, her scientific mind engaged. "It's not just wandering around. It's moving like it has a specific destination." Samuel, still pressed against the window, noticed something that the others missed. "It keeps stopping and lifting its nose," he said, "like it's smelling something." What the family couldn't know was that MB341 had indeed detected scent markers that indicated human presence. Polar bears possess an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting odors from up to 20 miles away under the right conditions. The bear had been following a scent trail that included cooking odors from their breakfast preparations, human waste products, and the general smell of human habitation that permeated the area around their cabin. At 7:41 a.m., the bear disappeared behind a low ridge, and the family's attention turned to other matters. Henry attempted once again to raise someone on the radio, turning the dial through various emergency frequencies without success. The radio produced only static and occasional fragments of distant conversations that faded in and out with atmospheric conditions. Laura began preparing a more substantial breakfast, opening canned goods and heating water for coffee on the camp stove. The normalcy of these activities helped ease the tension that had built up during their bear sighting. Emma returned to her journal, adding detailed notes about the bear's behavior and appearance, while Samuel helped his father add wood to the fire. The temperature inside the cabin had risen to a comfortable 68 degrees, creating a stark contrast with the hostile environment outside. This warmth, combined with the cooking odors and the general sounds of human activity, created a scent beacon that was drawing MB341 closer with each passing minute. At 8:15 a.m., Marcus Ironbear began his daily routine of checking the area around his cabin for signs of wildlife activity. What he discovered in the snow around his property filled him with a growing sense of alarm. The polar bear tracks he had noticed earlier were not isolated. They formed part of a clear pattern that indicated the animal had spent considerable time investigating his cabin during the night. More troubling was the direction the tracks led when they departed his property. Ironbear had lived in this area long enough to know every cabin, every structure, and every human presence within a 20-mile radius. The track pattern led directly toward the area where he knew the tourist family was staying. He had encountered Henry Weston briefly 3 days earlier when the family had stopped at his cabin to ask for directions, and he had been struck by their obvious inexperience with Arctic conditions. Ironbear attempted to contact the Churchill RCMP detachment using his own radio system, but atmospheric conditions were interfering with transmissions throughout the region. A high-pressure system combined with unusual solar activity was creating communication blackouts that would persist throughout the day. At the RCMP detachment in Churchill, Constable David Nakeko was beginning his morning shift unaware of the developing situation. Nakeko, 31 years old and a 12-year veteran of northern policing, had responded to numerous wildlife encounters during his career, including 3 fatal polar bear attacks. He understood better than most how quickly situations could deteriorate when bears and humans came into contact under the wrong circumstances. The detachment's morning briefing at 8:30 a.m. included routine discussions of weather conditions, road closures, and community events, but nothing about unusual bear activity. Dr. Morrison's warnings about increased bear sightings had been filed but not yet distributed to field officers, a bureaucratic delay that would have tragic consequences. Meanwhile, at the Weston cabin, the family was settling into what they assumed would be another peaceful day of wilderness observation. Emma had convinced her parents to let her set up a small observation post near the front window, complete with binoculars and her journal. Samuel was working on a detailed drawing of the cabin's interior, using colored pencils to capture the warm, cozy atmosphere that had become their temporary home. Henry spent time examining their food storage procedures, double-checking that everything was properly sealed and stored according to the guidelines Mackenzie had provided. Their supplies were adequate for another 4 days, with canned goods, dried foods, and bottled water carefully organized in the cabin's small pantry area. What Henry didn't realize was that despite his careful storage methods, the simple act of opening canned goods and cooking food had released odors that were broadcasting their presence across miles of frozen landscape. Laura was reading a paperback novel she had brought from home, occasionally glancing up to watch her children or to add wood to the fire. The domestic tranquility of the scene was almost perfect, marred only by the constant wind outside and the periodic creaking of the cabin's wooden frame as it adjusted to temperature variations. At 9:12 a.m., Samuel made another observation that would later prove significant. While sketching near the side window, he noticed what appeared to be disturbances in the snow approximately 150 yards from the cabin. The disturbances formed a rough line that seemed to circle their position at a consistent distance. "Dad, I think that bear might have come closer during the night," Samuel said, pointing toward the markings he had noticed. Henry studied the area through binoculars, trying to determine whether the disturbances were indeed bear tracks or simply wind patterns in the snow. The distance and blowing snow made it difficult to be certain, but the formations did have the appearance of a large animal's trail. "Even if it did come closer, that's not necessarily a problem," Henry said, trying to maintain a calm atmosphere. "Bears are curious animals. It was probably just investigating and then moved on." What Henry couldn't see from his vantage point was that the tracks actually formed a complete circle around their cabin, with several areas where the animal had stopped for extended periods, apparently studying the structure and its occupants. This circling behavior was characteristic of a polar bear that was actively hunting rather than simply exploring. Dr. Morrison, working at her research station in Churchill, was becoming increasingly concerned about the communication blackouts that were preventing her from contacting remote areas. Her monitoring equipment showed that several tagged bears in the region had been unusually active over the previous week, with movement patterns that suggested they were approaching human habitation areas. At 9:45 a.m., Morrison attempted to contact the RCMP detachment to discuss the possibility of conducting welfare checks on remote cabins in the area. Her call was routed to voicemail due to the communication difficulties, and her message wouldn't be retrieved until much later in the day. The Weston family's morning continued with a false sense of security that was becoming increasingly dangerous as each hour passed. Emma had identified several bird species through the cabin windows and was excited about the possibility of spotting an Arctic fox, which, according to her research guides, were common in the area. Henry decided to venture outside briefly to check their vehicle and to clear snow from around the cabin's entrance. The family's rented SUV was parked approximately 30 yards from the cabin, and Henry wanted to ensure it would start if they needed to leave unexpectedly. This decision to go outside would prove to be a critical mistake. At 10:23 a.m., Henry opened the cabin door and stepped into the brutal cold of the Arctic morning. The temperature shock was immediate and overwhelming, despite his heavy winter clothing. The wind cut through his layers of protection with surprising intensity, and he realized that spending any extended time outside would be genuinely dangerous. The act of opening the cabin door released a concentrated blast of warm, food-scented air into the surrounding environment. This scent plume was detected immediately by MB341, who had been positioned approximately 200 yards downwind from the cabin for the previous hour. Henry spent less than 5 minutes outside, just long enough to start the SUV and let it run briefly to ensure the engine would function properly. He cleared snow from around the cabin's entrance and checked that their emergency supplies stored in the vehicle were still accessible. During this brief excursion, he noticed several areas in the snow that might have been animal tracks, but the wind was obliterating evidence almost as quickly as it was created. When Henry returned to the cabin, he found his family gathered around the front window, watching something in the distance with obvious excitement. Laura turned to him with bright eyes as he stamped snow from his boots. "Henry, you just missed it," she said. "The bear came back." It was much closer this time. Emma was practically bouncing with enthusiasm. "Dad, it was amazing. It was only about 100 yards away and we could see everything. The way it moved, the way it held its head. It was exactly like the videos we watched before the trip." Samuel was less animated, but equally focused. "It was looking at the cabin," he said quietly, "not just looking around, looking right at us." Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outdoor temperature. While a bear's curiosity was natural, The animal's repeated returns to their immediate area suggested a level of interest that might be problematic. He retrieved the satellite phone Mackenzie had provided as emergency equipment, hoping to contact someone who could provide advice about their situation. The satellite phone, like their radio, was affected by the atmospheric conditions that were disrupting communications throughout the region. Henry's attempts to establish a connection resulted in error messages and failed call attempts. The phone's display showed full signal strength, but something was interfering with the actual transmission of calls. At 10:47 a.m., the situation escalated dramatically. Emma, who had maintained her watch at the front window, suddenly stepped back with a sharp gasp. "It's coming toward us," she said, her voice tight with excitement and the first hint of genuine concern. "It's walking straight toward the cabin." The entire family gathered at the front window to watch as MB341 approached their shelter with the deliberate, purposeful gait of an animal that had made a decision. The bear was massive, larger than any of them had imagined, despite their research and preparation. Its yellowish-white fur was thick and pristine, and its black nose and eyes stood out starkly against the pale backdrop of the tundra. "Should we make noise to scare it away?" Laura asked, her nursing background making her think in terms of prevention and early intervention. Henry consulted the emergency guidelines Mackenzie had provided, scanning the text for relevant advice. The guidelines were clear. In the event of a polar bear approach, occupants should remain inside, avoid making noise that might attract attention, and wait for the animal to lose interest and depart. "We stay quiet and still," Henry decided. "Everything I've read says that bears usually investigate and then leave if they don't find food sources." The bear's approach was methodical and purposeful. MB341 moved in a straight line toward the cabin, pausing occasionally to test the air with his sensitive nose. The family watched in fascination and growing apprehension as the massive animal covered the distance between his previous position and their shelter. At 10:52 a.m., the bear reached the immediate vicinity of the cabin and began what wildlife experts would later recognize as an inspection behavior, typical of polar bears, investigating potential food sources. MB341 circled the structure slowly, testing the air around each window and door, occasionally rising on his hind legs to examine the roofline and upper walls. From inside the cabin, the family could hear the bear's movements, the soft crunch of snow under massive paws, the sound of his breathing, and occasionally the scrape of claws against the cabin's exterior walls. These sounds, while expected, were far more intimidating when experienced firsthand than any of them had anticipated. "He's so big," Samuel whispered, his artistic eye capturing details that the others missed. "Look at how thick his legs are, and his paws, they're enormous." Emma was still taking notes, but her handwriting had become less steady as the reality of their situation became more apparent. "He's been walking around us for almost 10 minutes, she observed. "In the books, it said they usually investigate quickly and then leave." The bear's behavior was indeed unusual for a typical investigation. MB341 was demonstrating a level of persistence and focus that suggested he had identified the cabin as a potential food source worth extended attention. His circling pattern was growing tighter with each revolution, and he was spending more time examining the doors and windows. At 11:08 a.m., the bear approached the front door directly for the first time. The family could hear him sniffing loudly at the base of the door, and they could see his massive form through the window positioned beside the entrance. The bear rose on his hind legs, placing his front paws against the door and testing its stability with his considerable weight. "The door is solid," Henry said, as much to reassure himself as his family. Mackenzie said it was designed specifically to keep bears out. The door was indeed well constructed, with metal reinforcement and a deadbolt system that exceeded typical residential standards. However, the doorframe was original to the 1970s construction, and 47 years of freeze-thaw cycles had created small gaps and weaknesses that weren't immediately apparent. MB341's investigation of the door continued for several minutes, during which he applied increasing pressure to test the structure's integrity. The bear's intelligence was evident in his methodical approach. He was learning about the barrier between himself and the source of the intriguing sense that had drawn him to this location. Laura found herself thinking about their decision to take this trip, wondering if they had been naive about the risks involved. Her medical training made her acutely aware of how far they were from any kind of emergency medical care, and how quickly a wilderness situation could become life-threatening. "Maybe we should try the radio again," she suggested, "or the satellite phone. Someone should know about this." Henry made another attempt to contact authorities, cycling through emergency frequencies on the radio and trying multiple numbers on the satellite phone. The communication blackout was complete. No signals were getting through the atmospheric interference that continued to affect the entire region. At 11:23 a.m., the bear moved away from the front door and continued his inspection of the cabin's perimeter. The family began to hope that his interest was waning and that he would soon depart in search of more promising food sources. This hope was premature. MB341 had discovered the area where Henry had disposed of their food scraps the previous evening. Despite Henry's belief that he had followed proper protocols by burying the waste in snow well away from the cabin, the bear's extraordinary sense of smell had easily located the buried material. The bear spent considerable time investigating this discovery, digging through the snow and consuming the small amount of organic waste that Henry had buried. This finding reinforced MB341's association between the cabin and food sources, making it increasingly unlikely that he would simply lose interest and depart. "He found something," Samuel observed, watching the bear's digging behavior through the side window. "He's eating something from the snow." Henry felt a sinking sensation as he realized what the bear had discovered. He had followed what he thought were proper disposal methods, but clearly his efforts had been inadequate for the reality of polar bear behavior in the wild. The discovery of food waste marked a turning point in the encounter. MB341's behavior shifted from investigative to acquisitive, as he confirmed that this location was indeed associated with available food. His subsequent actions would be driven by this confirmation rather than mere curiosity. At 11:41 a.m., the bear returned to the front door with renewed purpose. This time, his approach was more aggressive, and his testing of the door's integrity was more forceful. The family could hear the wood creaking under the pressure as MB341 pushed against the barrier with his full weight. "That doesn't sound good," Laura said, her voice tight with growing concern. Henry was studying the doorframe, looking for signs of weakness or failure. The metal reinforcement was holding, but he could see that the frame itself was beginning to show stress where the deadbolt connected to the door jamb. Emma was no longer taking notes. Her journal lay forgotten on the table as she stared at the door, beginning to understand that their situation might be more serious than any of them had initially realized. The sound of the bear's efforts to breach the door was becoming increasingly violent. MB341 was using his claws to rake at the wood around the doorframe, creating visible scratches and gouges in the exterior surface. The sound of claws on wood was audible inside the cabin, sharp and purposeful. "Dad, what do we do if he gets in?" Samuel asked, his quiet voice cutting through the tension. The question hung in the air as Henry realized he didn't have a good answer. Their emergency preparations had focused on cold weather survival, equipment failures, and medical emergencies, but they had no specific plan for dealing with a polar bear that was actively trying to enter their shelter. At 11:58 a.m., the bear's assault on the door escalated dramatically. MB341 began using his full body weight as a battering ram, throwing himself against the door with tremendous force. Each impact shook the entire cabin and produced splintering sounds from the doorframe. "We need to get away from the door," Henry decided, moving his family toward the back of the cabin. "If it gives way, we don't want to be standing right there." The family retreated to the bedroom area, though the cabin's small size meant they were still only yards away from the potential breach point. Laura gathered the children close to her, while Henry positioned himself between his family and the front door. The door was showing visible signs of damage now. The frame was separating from the wall in several places, and the deadbolt housing was beginning to pull away from the wood. Mackenzie's assurances about the door's bear-proof construction were proving inadequate against the reality of a determined 1,200-pound polar bear. At 12:07 p.m. on December 29, 2024, the front door of the Weston family's rented cabin finally gave way. The failure was sudden and complete. The door frame splintered with a sound like gunshots, and the door itself was driven inward with such force that it struck the opposite wall and rebounded. MB341 filled the doorway immediately, his massive form blocking out the daylight as he surveyed the interior of the cabin. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the bear and the family stared at each other across the small space of the cabin's main room. MB341's dark eyes took in every detail of the scene. The humans huddled together, the warm air filled with cooking scents and the various food containers and supplies that represented exactly what he had been seeking. "Nobody move," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay perfectly still." The bear entered the cabin slowly, his massive paws silent on the wooden floor despite his enormous weight. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his attention focused completely on the humans before him. MB341's behavior was no longer that of a curious scavenger. He had transitioned into active hunting mode. Laura felt her medical training kick in as adrenaline flooded her system. She was acutely aware of her heart rate, her breathing, and the need to remain calm for her children's sake. But she was also calculating distances, exit routes, and the medical implications of various injury scenarios that might develop in the next few minutes. Emma pressed closer to her mother, her scientific fascination with polar bears overwhelmed by the reality of facing one in an enclosed space. The bear was larger than she had imagined possible, and his presence filled the cabin with an aura of power and danger that no nature documentary had conveyed. Samuel was studying the bear's face, his artistic eye noting details even in this moment of extreme stress. The bear's expression was alert and intelligent, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had already made decisions about what would happen next. MB341 moved deeper into the cabin, his nose testing the air constantly as he catalogued the various scents that had drawn him to this location. The bear's attention was initially focused on the food storage areas, but his awareness of the humans never wavered. Henry was trying to remember everything he had read about polar bear encounters, but most of the literature assumed that such encounters would occur in open terrain where escape might be possible. The reality of being trapped in a small enclosed space with an adult male polar bear was beyond anything he had prepared for. The bear's investigation of the cabin's interior was methodical and thorough. MB341 examined the food storage containers, the cooking area, and the various human belongings with the patience of an animal that knew his prey had nowhere to go. This leisurely approach was more terrifying than any immediate attack might have been. At 12:14 p.m., the bear's attention turned more directly to the family. MB341 had completed his examination of the cabin's contents and had confirmed that this location contained exactly what he had been seeking. Now his focus shifted to the humans, who represented both a potential threat and a potential food source. "If he charges, get behind me," Henry told his family, though he knew that his position would provide little actual protection against an animal of MB341's size and power. The bear approached them slowly, his movements deliberate and purposeful. Each step brought 1,200 pounds of predator closer to a family that had no experience with this type of life-threatening situation. The cabin's walls, which had provided a sense of security for 3 days, now served as a trap that eliminated any possibility of escape. Laura found herself thinking about her patients at Minneapolis Children's Hospital, children who faced life-threatening situations with courage that amazed her every day. She drew on that inspiration now, determined to protect her own children no matter what the cost. Emma was trying to remember specific facts about polar bear behavior, searching for some piece of information that might help them survive the next few minutes. But academic knowledge seemed inadequate in the face of the massive predator that dominated their shelter. Samuel was watching the bear's eyes, recognizing an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. This was not simply a wild animal acting on instinct. This was a thinking creature that was making calculated decisions about the situation. At 12:18 p.m., MB341 made his decision. The bear's posture shifted subtly, his muscles tensing in preparation for action. Anyone with extensive experience with polar bears would have recognized the signs of an animal transitioning from investigation to attack mode. The attack began with shocking speed. Despite his enormous size, MB341 moved with the lightning reflexes of an apex predator. His initial charge covered the distance to the family in less than 2 seconds, eliminating any possibility of evasive action. Henry attempted to place himself between the bear and his family, but MB341's first swipe caught him across the chest and sent him crashing against the cabin's rear wall. The force of the blow was devastating, and Henry felt ribs breaking as he struck the wooden planks. Laura's nursing instincts kicked in as she saw her husband injured, but her primary focus remained on protecting her children. She pushed Emma and Samuel toward the bedroom door, hoping to create some barrier between them and the attacking bear. The confined space of the cabin worked against any defensive strategies. MB341's massive size meant that he could reach any point in the structure within seconds, and there was no room for the family to maneuver or create distance from the threat. Emma found herself separated from her family by the bear's position, trapped near the front window, with no clear path to rejoin her parents and brother. She pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible while trying not to make any sudden movements that might draw the bear's attention. Samuel was close enough to his mother to feel her protective embrace, but he could see the terror in her eyes as she realized that there was no way to shield him from what was happening. The boy's artistic perception allowed him to capture details of the scene that would later prove important to investigators, if any of them survived to provide testimony. The bear's second attack was directed at Laura, who was attempting to shield Samuel with her own body. MB341's claws raked across her back and shoulders, the sharp points penetrating her heavy winter clothing and inflicting deep lacerations that immediately began bleeding heavily. Henry, despite his injuries, attempted to intervene by throwing objects at the bear and shouting to distract the animal from his family. A camp stove, cooking utensils, and canned goods became projectiles in his desperate attempt to alter the bear's focus. MB341 was not deterred by these efforts. The bear's hunting instincts were fully engaged now, and he demonstrated the systematic approach that made polar bears such efficient predators. Each movement was calculated to maximize damage while minimizing risk to himself. The sounds of the attack filled the small cabin, the bear's breathing, the splintering of furniture as the massive animal moved through the space, human cries of pain and terror, and the wet sounds of claws meeting flesh. These sounds would later be described by investigators as among the most disturbing they had ever encountered. Laura's medical training allowed her to maintain some analytical awareness even as she was being attacked. She could feel the specific nature of her injuries, could assess the damage being done to her family, and could calculate their chances of survival with the cold precision of someone who had seen trauma patients in hospital emergency rooms. Emma, trapped against the front wall, was witnessing the destruction of her family while being unable to help or escape. The 11-year-old's scientific mind continued to function even in extremity, cataloguing details that her conscious mind rejected, but that would be preserved in the traumatic memories that would haunt any survivors. Samuel's artistic perception captured the color patterns of blood against snow, the way light from the broken doorway illuminated the scene, and the terrible grace of the polar bear's movements as it continued its methodical attack. These visual memories would later provide crucial evidence for investigators attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events. Henry's attempts at intervention were becoming weaker as blood loss and shock began to affect his physical capabilities. The injuries from the bear's initial attack were severe enough to be life-threatening, even without further trauma, but MB341 was not finished with the family that had attracted him to this remote location. At 12:23 p.m., the bear's attention turned to Emma, who had remained pressed against the front wall throughout the initial phase of the attack. The 11-year-old's attempts to remain motionless and inconspicuous had been successful for several minutes, but MB341's systematic approach to the situation meant that her turn was inevitable. Emma found herself face to face with the massive predator, looking directly into eyes that showed intelligence, determination, and no hint of mercy. This was the moment when her academic understanding of polar bears encountered the reality of being prey to one of nature's most efficient predators. The bear's approach to Emma was almost gentle compared to the violence he had shown toward the adults. MB341 seemed to recognize that the child posed no threat and required less force to subdue. This recognition would prove to be tragically accurate. Samuel watched his sister's encounter with the bear while still sheltered partially by their mother's body, though Laura's protective capabilities were severely diminished by her own injuries. The 9-year-old's quiet nature served him well in this moment, as his stillness had made him less of a target for the bear's attention. Henry made one final attempt to reach his daughter, driven by parental instincts that overcame his physical limitations. But his injuries had reduced him to crawling movements that were painfully slow compared to the bear's lightning reflexes. The attack on Emma was mercifully brief, though no less devastating for its short duration. MB341's experience as a predator allowed him to inflict fatal injuries with efficiency that minimized the child's suffering while maximizing the damage to the family unit that represented his food source. Laura's final conscious thoughts were focused on Samuel, the only member of her family who might still have a chance of survival if she could somehow distract the bear's attention from him. Her nursing background had taught her about triage, the process of determining who could be saved when resources were limited. In this case, the resource was time, and Samuel represented their only hope. The polar bear's attention turned to Samuel at 12:26 p.m., completing his systematic elimination of the threat represented by the human family. The 9-year-old's artistic eye had captured every detail of the preceding events, but this final phase of the attack would be experienced rather than observed. Samuel's encounter with MB341 was characterized by the same efficiency that the bear had demonstrated throughout the attack. The child's small size meant that the bear's methods required minimal adjustment, and the outcome was predetermined by the massive disparity in size and power between predator and prey. Henry's consciousness faded as blood loss and shock overwhelmed his system. His final moments focused on the sounds of his family's destruction and his complete inability to prevent or alter the outcome of their wilderness adventure. By 12:29 p.m. on December 29, 2024, the attack was complete. The Weston family's Christmas vacation had ended in a remote cabin that had become the scene of one of the most devastating polar bear attacks in Manitoba's recorded history. MB341 spent the next several hours in the cabin, consuming portions of his kill while also investigating the food supplies that had originally attracted him to the location. The bear's behavior during this period was typical of polar bears after a successful hunt: methodical consumption combined with territorial defense of his food source. The atmospheric conditions that had prevented the family from calling for help continued throughout the day, ensuring that their failure to check in with family members back home would not be noticed for several days. The communication blackout also prevented any chance discoveries of their situation by other remote residents or passing aircraft. Marcus Ironbear, the nearest neighbor, had spent the day attempting to contact authorities about his concerns regarding bear activity in the area. His radio messages were not getting through due to the same atmospheric interference that had isolated the Weston family, and his attempts to travel to check on them were prevented by deteriorating weather conditions. Dr. Rachel Morrison continued her attempts to contact remote locations throughout the day, but the communication systems that normally allowed her to coordinate with wildlife authorities and remote residents remained frustratingly silent. Her research station's equipment showed increasing signs of polar bear activity in the region, but she had no way to share this information with those who might be at risk. The RCMP detachment in Churchill operated normally throughout December 29th, unaware that a catastrophic wildlife attack was occurring less than 30 miles from their location. The communication blackouts meant that routine check-ins and emergency calls were not getting through, creating a false sense that all was well in the remote areas under their jurisdiction. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate throughout the afternoon and evening, with blowing snow and extreme cold that would have made any rescue attempts extremely dangerous, even if the family's situation had been known to authorities. MB341 remained in the vicinity of the cabin through the night of December 29th and into the early morning hours of December 30th. The bear's behavior during this period was consistent with polar bears defending a food source. He maintained a territorial presence while consuming his kill and investigating the human artifacts that filled the structure. The first sign that something was wrong came on December 31st, when Henry's brother Michael in Minneapolis became concerned about the family's failure to return scheduled phone calls. Michael Weston, 45, was a commercial pilot who understood the importance of maintaining communication schedules, especially when family members were traveling in remote areas. Michael's initial attempts to contact his brother were frustrated by the same atmospheric conditions that had isolated the family during the attack. Phone calls to their satellite phone went directly to voicemail, and attempts to reach them through the cabin's radio system produced only static. On January 1st, 2025, Michael contacted the RCMP detachment in Churchill to request a welfare check on his brother's family. Constable Nakeko received the call and agreed to investigate, though he noted that communication difficulties had been widespread throughout the region for several days. The weather on January 1st had improved enough to allow travel, and Constable Nakeko departed Churchill at 10:30 a.m. with plans to reach the Weston cabin by early afternoon. He was accompanied by Conservation Officer James Sinclair, who had experience with wildlife encounters and could provide expertise if the family's situation involved animal activity. Nakeko and Sinclair followed the ice road that provided access to the remote cabin, noting signs of recent polar bear activity along the route. Large tracks were visible in several locations, and Sinclair identified them as belonging to an adult male of significant size. The officers reached the cabin at 1:47 p.m. and immediately noticed that the front door was missing from its frame. The structure showed obvious signs of damage, with splintered wood and scattered debris visible from their approach route. "This doesn't look good," Sinclair observed, noting the pattern of damage to the cabin's entrance. His experience with wildlife attacks allowed him to recognize the signs of a polar bear intrusion even before they examined the scene closely. Nakeko called for backup and additional resources before approaching the cabin, following protocols for potential crime scenes, even though the damage suggested a wildlife encounter rather than human criminal activity. The officer's initial examination of the cabin's exterior revealed extensive bear sign, tracks, claw marks on the walls, and areas where the animal had investigated the structure's perimeter. The evidence suggested that a large polar bear had spent considerable time at the location over a period of several days. "There's blood on the doorframe," Nakeko reported, documenting the scene with photographs before proceeding with their investigation. The presence of blood confirmed that the bear's intrusion had resulted in human casualties. Sinclair identified additional bear sign indicating that the animal had remained in the area for an extended period after gaining entry to the cabin. Scat samples and territorial markings suggested that the bear had claimed the location as a food source. The officer's entry into the cabin at 2:23 p.m. revealed a scene that would be described in official reports as one of the most disturbing wildlife attack sites in Manitoba's history. The interior of the structure showed signs of extensive predator activity, with evidence that the bear had spent considerable time consuming his kill. Nakeko immediately secured the scene and called for additional resources, including the RCMP Major Crimes Unit, the Provincial Coroner's Office, and wildlife management specialists. The scope of the investigation would require expertise from multiple agencies. Dr. Morrison was contacted and asked to provide consultation on the bear behavior evidenced at the scene. Her analysis would be crucial for understanding how the attack had developed and what factors had contributed to its severity. The recovery of human remains from the cabin required specialized equipment and expertise, as the bear's feeding behavior had complicated the scene significantly. Forensic specialists worked carefully to document every detail while preserving evidence that might help explain the sequence of events. Physical evidence recovered from the scene included the family's personal belongings, camera equipment containing photographs from their trip, and Emma's journal with detailed observations about polar bear behavior in the days leading up to the attack. The investigation revealed that the Weston family had followed most recommended safety protocols for traveling in polar bear country, but that several factors had combined to create a perfect storm of circumstances that led to the tragedy. Analysis of weather data confirmed that atmospheric conditions had prevented the family from communicating with the outside world during the critical period when the bear was approaching their location. Communication blackouts had also prevented warnings about increased bear activity from reaching remote areas. Food storage practices at the cabin were found to be generally adequate, but the disposal of organic waste had created scent markers that attracted MB341 to the location. Even small amounts of food waste could draw polar bears from significant distances under the right atmospheric conditions. The cabin's structural integrity was found to be inadequate for deterring a determined polar bear of MB341 size and persistence. While the door exceeded normal residential standards, it was not sufficient to withstand the prolonged assault of a 1,200-pound predator. MB341 was tracked and located by wildlife officers on January 3rd, approximately 2 miles from the attack site. The bear showed no fear of humans and demonstrated territorial behavior consistent with an animal that had developed associations between human habitation and food sources. The decision to destroy MB341 was made jointly by wildlife management officials and RCMP investigators based on the bear's demonstrated threat to human safety and his learned behavior patterns that made relocation ineffective. Dr. Morrison's analysis of the attack sequence revealed that MB341 had likely been investigating human habitation sites in the area for several weeks before encountering the Weston family. The bear's systematic approach to breaching the cabin suggested experience with human structures. Necropsy examination of MB341 revealed that the bear was in excellent physical condition and showed no signs of injury, disease, or nutritional stress that might have driven him to hunt humans. His attack on the family appeared to be opportunistic predation rather than desperation feeding. The coroner's investigation into the deaths of the Weston family members concluded that all 4 had died from injuries consistent with polar bear attack. The sequence of events was reconstructed based on physical evidence, scene analysis, and consultation with wildlife behavior experts. Media coverage of the Churchill attack was extensive, with news outlets describing it as one of the most tragic wildlife encounters in recent Canadian history. The remote location and the family's complete isolation during the attack contributed to public fascination with the story. The rental cabin's owner, Garrett Mackenzie, faced legal scrutiny regarding the adequacy of safety measures at his property. While no criminal charges were filed, civil litigation resulted in settlements with the victims' families and new regulations for remote rental properties in polar bear habitat. Safety protocols for remote travelers in polar bear country were reviewed and updated following the investigation, with new emphasis on communication requirements, structural standards for shelters, and waste disposal procedures. The Manitoba government implemented new requirements for remote accommodation providers, including mandatory bear deterrent systems, improved communication equipment, and regular safety inspections of properties in wildlife habitat areas. Dr. Morrison used data from the Churchill attack to develop improved protocols for monitoring polar bear activity near human settlements. Her research contributed to better early warning systems for remote communities and travelers. The Weston family's tragic deaths highlighted the increasing challenges of human-wildlife coexistence as climate change alters traditional polar bear habitat and behavior patterns. Their story became a case study in wilderness safety education programs across North America. Emma's journal, recovered from the cabin, provided valuable insights into polar bear behavior in the days leading up to the attack. Her detailed observations were used by researchers to better understand the warning signs that indicate when a bear's interest in human habitation is escalating to dangerous levels. Samuel's artistic documentation of the family's trip, including sketches made during the attack, provided forensic investigators with crucial details about the bear's behavior and the sequence of events. His visual records were used to create accurate reconstructions of the incident. Henry's brother Michael became an advocate for improved safety regulations in remote recreation areas, working with government agencies and tourism operators to prevent similar tragedies. His efforts led to enhanced safety requirements for wilderness tour operators throughout Canada. Laura's colleagues at Minneapolis Children's Hospital established a memorial fund in the family's honor, supporting wilderness safety education programs for families and children. The fund continues to provide resources for teaching young people about wildlife safety and outdoor survival skills. The Churchill attack became a turning point in Canadian wildlife management policy, leading to increased funding for polar bear research and monitoring programs. The tragedy demonstrated the need for better integration between wildlife science and public safety efforts. Remote communication systems in polar bear habitat areas were upgraded following the attack, with redundant systems designed to prevent the type of communication blackout that had isolated the Weston family during their ordeal. Emergency response protocols for remote areas were enhanced, with improved coordination between RCMP, conservation officers, and wildlife researchers. The goal was to ensure that future wildlife emergencies could be detected and responded to more quickly. The cabin where the attack occurred was eventually demolished, with the site converted to a research station for studying polar bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions. The location serves as a reminder of the tragedy while contributing to efforts to prevent similar incidents. 10 years after the attack, the Churchill community continues to honor the memory of the Weston family while working to balance the needs of polar bear conservation with human safety. The tragedy serves as a constant reminder of the power and unpredictability of the Arctic's apex predator. The last light of Churchill, as the incident came to be known, represents one of the most thoroughly documented polar bear attacks in history. The extensive evidence collected during the investigation continues to inform wildlife management decisions and safety protocols throughout the Arctic regions, where humans and polar bears share the landscape. The Weston family's story serves as both a tragedy and a teaching tool, demonstrating the importance of respecting the power of wilderness and the animals that call it home. Their deaths were not in vain if they prevent future tragedies through improved safety measures and better understanding of polar bear behavior. In the end, the last light of Churchill stands as a testament to the awesome power of nature and the vulnerability of humans when they venture into domains ruled by apex predators. The polar bear that killed the Weston family was simply following his natural instincts, but the tragedy might have been prevented with better safety protocols, improved communication systems, and greater understanding of polar bear behavior patterns. The investigation into the deaths of Henry, Laura, Emma, and Samuel Weston revealed a complex interaction of factors that combined to create a perfect storm of circumstances. Their story continues to influence wildlife management policy, safety regulations, and public education efforts throughout the Arctic, ensuring that their tragic deaths contribute to the safety of future wilderness travelers. The last light of Churchill will forever remain a sobering reminder that in the Arctic wilderness, humans are not the apex predator, and that survival depends on respect, preparation, and sometimes simply luck. The Weston family's final days in that remote cabin demonstrate both the allure and the mortal danger of seeking adventure in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments.